Settle in, get comfortable. Tonight we are going all the way into Springfield, and we are not coming out until we have turned every stone, followed every thread, and looked behind every cracked cooling tower in this town. The Simpsons has been running since the 17th of December, 1989. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, the longest-running animated series in American history. And in all that time, across every single one of those episodes, nobody in Springfield has aged a single day. That fact alone should unsettle you, and by the time this is over, it will. So dim the lights, breathe slowly, and let's begin. Section 1. The Radiation Theory. Springfield as Contamination Zone. There is a building at the edge of Springfield that you have been looking at for decades without really seeing it. It has 2 cooling towers. They leak. They have been patched with chewing gum at some point in their operational history, which is a sentence that should give any reasonable person pause. The facility failed a surprise safety inspection so thoroughly that the estimated cost of bringing it up to code was $56 million. The man who owned it, Charles Montgomery Burns, refused to spend a single cent of that money. Not because he was stretched thin financially. Burns is one of the wealthiest characters in the history of American fiction. He refused because fixing the violations would require admitting they existed, and admitting they existed would mean someone might start asking the next question, which is what exactly those violations had already done to the people living downwind. That building is the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant, and the theory we are starting with tonight is the one that ties everything else together. The one that sits at the foundation of nearly every other mystery in this show. The idea that the power plant is not just a place where Homer Simpson works. It is the engine behind the entire strangeness of Springfield. It has been mutating the town, the people, the animals, and possibly the landscape itself for as long as the show has been on the air. And the evidence is not subtle. It has never been subtle. The show has been showing you this evidence for 36 years straight. Let's walk through it slowly. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. That is not a detail invented for the theory. That is canonical information established within the show itself. The plant is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town of Springfield. Every light that turns on in every house, every business, every school, every hospital, is drawing power from a facility that was found to have 342 safety violations during a single inspection. 342. That number gets mentioned in the show and then the episode moves on, as Springfield always does, but sit with that figure for a moment. Most regulatory violations are individual, specific failures. A piece of faulty wiring here, a missing safety label there. 342 violations in a single facility suggests something more systemic than neglect. It suggests that the entire operation is structured around cutting corners, that safety was never the priority, and that whatever has been leaking out of that building has been leaking for a very long time. The violations the show actually shows you are not bureaucratic abstractions. They are visceral. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water. Radioactive waste being deposited on children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used as a paperweight on someone's desk, sitting there in the open air of an office where people work and breathe every single day. Cracked cooling towers that were patched with gum. Luminous rats running through the lower levels of the facility. Rats that glow in the dark because they have been exposed to enough radiation to alter their biology visibly. And then there is the detail the show drops once and never returns to. Skeletons. Human skeletons discovered in the basement of an active, operational nuclear power plant. The show does not explain who those people were. It does not suggest any investigation. It does not raise any alarm. It simply shows you human remains inside a working reactor facility, and then the scene continues. And nobody in Springfield asks a single question about what happened to those people. The safety inspector responsible for preventing all of this is Homer Simpson. The show's own creator has stated that Homer has an IQ of 55. In the episode where Homer discovers that a crayon has been lodged in his brain since childhood, the removal of that crayon causes his intelligence to rise dramatically, which means his baseline cognitive function throughout the series is being physically suppressed by a foreign object in his skull. This is the man whose job description includes ensuring that a nuclear reactor does not poison the town surrounding it. He sleeps at his workstation. He eats during meltdown warnings. He once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to observe whether it would grow larger. That is the person standing between Springfield and a radioactive catastrophe, and he has been standing there, in that exact capacity, for over 3 decades. Now let's talk about what the radiation is actually doing to Springfield, because the show tells you this directly in Season 2. A fish is caught in a river near the power plant. The fish has 3 eyes. It is named Blinky, and it becomes national news within the universe of the show. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as evidence that Burns is contaminating the local water supply. Burns is eventually forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate its harmlessness. He does so. The town watches. And then the town shrugs and moves on. And nobody conducts a follow-up study. And nobody tests the water for contamination. And nobody asks the question that is sitting right there in the open, unavoidable and unasked. If the fish living in the water have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people drinking that same water every single day? The answer arrives in Season 8, in an episode called The Springfield Files. Homer sees something in the woods near Springfield. He is convinced it is an alien. The entire town gets involved. FBI agents arrive. The episode builds toward a dramatic reveal, and when the reveal finally comes, the figure in the woods is not an alien at all. It is Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so extreme, so saturated with chemicals and radiation therapy, that it causes his entire body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without the next dose, he dies. After each session, Burns wanders out of his facility in a dazed and euphoric state, barely conscious, stumbling through the woods in the dark, his body literally radiating visible light. Homer sees this glowing figure moving through the trees, and his first instinct is not radiation poisoning, not the power plant, not any environmental explanation. His first instinct is that it must be an alien from outer space. That is how completely the radiation theory has been suppressed in the minds of Springfield residents. A man who glows in the dark walks out of the woods near a nuclear facility, and the population's first thought is extraterrestrial contact, not the obvious alternative. The Simpsons movie takes this further than any individual episode. The environmental contamination in Springfield reaches a level so catastrophic that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal agency operating within the fiction of the show, determines that the town must be physically sealed under a massive glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the surrounding region. Think carefully about what that means. The United States government, looking at Springfield, concluded that the entire town was so toxic, so fundamentally compromised as an environment, that the only viable solution was containment. Springfield is not just polluted. Springfield is classified as an environmental hazard by the federal government. The town itself has become the threat, and every single person who has been living inside it, drinking its water, breathing its air, raising their children in the shadow of those cracked cooling towers, they are all still inside when the dome goes up. Now look at the residents themselves. Look closely. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that does not correspond to normal human anatomy. His eyes bulge. His overbite is pronounced. He has 4 fingers on each hand. His intelligence, as established by the show, qualifies as a clinical disability. His body absorbs physical trauma at a rate that has no parallel in any documented medical literature. He has been shot. He has been electrocuted. He has fallen from cliffs. He has been struck by vehicles. He has survived explosions. He walks away from every single one of these events. His healing capacity is not just remarkable, it is impossible by any standard biological measure. He has worked in direct proximity to an active reactor core for the entirety of his adult life. Marge Simpson has the same pronounced eyes, the same 4 fingers. Her hair grows straight upward in a configuration that defies gravity, maintaining its shape without external product for 36 years. Marge was briefly employed at the nuclear power plant herself. She was exposed to the same facility, the same violations, the same ambient radiation that has been leaking into Springfield's environment. And all 3 of her children were born after both parents had already been living in that contaminated environment for years. Bart, Lisa, Maggie, all born in Springfield, all raised there, all drinking the same water, breathing the same air. And every single one of them displays physical characteristics that do not appear in normal human populations. The hair that maintains its shape without product, the overbites, the eyes, the yellow skin that covers every Springfield resident without exception, and no one else. That last detail is the one that makes this theory click into something more than speculation. When celebrities visit Springfield in the show, they look different from the residents. Not slightly different, not stylistically different, fundamentally different in terms of proportion and biological plausibility. Their features are more natural. Their eyes are shaped more like actual human eyes. Their proportions more closely resemble actual human anatomy. The show draws outsiders with noticeably more realistic features than it draws the people who live in Springfield full-time. The standard explanation for this, the one most viewers accept without examining it, is that it is just the art style. That is just how The Simpsons looks. But within the internal logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible and observable difference between people who live inside Springfield and people who arrive from outside it. The people in the contamination zone look mutated. The people outside it look normal. And that distinction is consistent across decades of episodes, consistent enough that it cannot be dismissed as random variation in animation style. Even the animals are affected. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging proportions as his owners, the same eyes, the same physical characteristics that deviate from what actual dogs look like. The show is telling you that the mutation does not stop at humans. It extends to every living thing sharing the same environment. Blinky the fish was the show's own explicit statement on what the radiation is doing to Springfield's biology. 3 eyes. That is not a subtle metaphor. That is the show looking directly at the audience and saying, this is what radiation exposure does to living organisms in this town, and then expecting you to believe that the exact same radiation is having no comparable effect on the humans drinking the same water and breathing the same air as that fish. Burns knows all of this. The show makes this clear across multiple episodes, and it is worth dwelling on because it transforms Burns from a cartoon villain into something considerably more calculated. Burns funds private medical research. He has personal physicians. He undergoes the weekly treatments we discussed. He understands radiation and its biological effects at a level no one else in Springfield possesses, because radiation is literally keeping him alive. He is personally dependent on managing its effects in his own body every single week. He has an entire pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of synthesizing experimental compounds. He knows precisely what his plant is doing to the people of Springfield, because those people and their environment serve as his long-running, unacknowledged laboratory. And Homer's continued employment is not negligence or forgetfulness on Burns's part. It is a deliberate operational decision. When German investors briefly purchased the plant in one episode, the first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was assess the true cost of bringing the facility into compliance with safety regulations, and the estimate nearly bankrupted them. Burns purchased the plant back almost immediately and rehired Homer without hesitation. A competent safety inspector would identify the violations. A competent safety inspector would file reports. A competent safety inspector would eventually either force the plant into compliance or have it shut down. Homer ensures none of that happens. The violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and by extension the population that depends on both. A population, it should be noted, that the radiation theory suggests may be too cognitively impaired from decades of exposure to fully understand what is happening to them. The crayon in Homer's brain is a thread worth pulling here, because the show itself invites you to pull it. Season 12 reveals that Homer had the crayon removed, and his intelligence rose dramatically. He became articulate, perceptive, capable of understanding his environment and his circumstances in ways the crayon-impaired version of him could not. And this newfound intelligence made him miserable. He could see Springfield clearly for the first time, and what he saw was unbearable. So he had the crayon reinserted. He chose the fog. He chose not to see. But the question the show skips over is the one that matters most to the theory. How did a crayon become lodged in a child's brain without anyone noticing? How did Homer pass through his entire childhood, his adolescence, and years of adult life in Springfield, visiting doctors, receiving checkups, without a single medical professional detecting a foreign object in his skull? Either the medical establishment in Springfield is so comprehensively incompetent that it cannot perform basic diagnostic evaluation, or someone in that medical establishment knew about the crayon and chose not to remove it. And if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of the town he essentially owns, then the crayon stops being a strange accident from Homer's childhood. It becomes something the theory treats as representative of a larger pattern. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains, something that keeps them compliant and incapable of looking at the evidence in front of them and drawing the obvious conclusion. The radiation theory, when you follow it all the way to its logical end, does not explain just one mystery about the Simpsons. It proposes explanations for nearly all of them, which is what makes it so persistent and so difficult to simply dismiss. The characters do not age because their biology has been altered at a cellular level by decades of radiation exposure. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's memory and reasoning functions are compromised by chronic neurological damage. Homer survives injuries that should be fatal because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that have made him nearly indestructible at the cost of his cognitive function. Burns sustains his impossible lifespan through treatments that would kill any normal person because he has access to resources that the rest of Springfield will never have. And nobody questions any of it, because the same environmental contamination that altered their bodies has also damaged the part of their brains responsible for asking why. Springfield is not a quirky animated town populated by eccentric characters. The radiation theory says it is a contamination zone, and the residents are not eccentrics. They are symptoms. The nuclear power plant that dominates the Springfield skyline, that lights every house and employs significant portions of the community and poisons the water supply, is not a background element, not a location detail, not a setting for Homer's workplace comedy. According to the radiation theory, it is the cause of everything. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every miraculous recovery from a fatal injury, every catastrophe that gets forgotten by the following episode. All of it, the theory says, traces back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible contamination into the same water supply, feeding the same damaged brains that cannot figure out why their fish have 3 eyes and their children were born with 4 fingers. The plant is not just part of the show. The plant, according to this theory, is the show. And Springfield will never figure that out because the plant already made sure it cannot. If you are still with me, drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. And if you want more nights like this one, the subscribe button is right there. Now let's keep going, because we are just getting started. Section 2. Homer's Coma. The dream that never ended. What if everything you just heard about Springfield was true, but only inside the mind of a man who has been unconscious since 1993? That is the Homer coma theory, and it is the single most discussed, most debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the entire history of The Simpsons. It does not compete with the radiation theory. In its most elegant form, it absorbs the radiation theory and contains it. Let's set the scene. The 1st of April, 1993. The 18th episode of Season 4 aired. The title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise of the episode was straightforward. Bart plays a series of escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer. Each one gets bigger than the last until Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. He shakes it until the pressure inside the can has built to an extraordinary level, then puts it back in the refrigerator. When Homer opens the can, the explosion is violent enough to send him to the hospital. He is badly injured but alive. He lies in a hospital bed, recovering. And then Homer notices a vending machine across the room. He reaches for a candy bar. The machine tips over. It crushes him. And Homer Simpson flatlines and enters a clinically unconscious state that lasts for 7 weeks. This is not presented as a gag. This is not a cutaway. This is not a dream sequence within the episode. Homer Simpson enters a real coma, documented within the show, lasting nearly 2 months. The episode ends with Homer apparently waking up. Bart is at his bedside, tearfully confessing that the prank was his fault, and Homer springs awake and immediately starts strangling his son. The family laughs. Homer laughs. Everything returns to the status quo. The episode communicates, clearly and without ambiguity, that Homer woke up from his coma. But in the final moments of that same episode, the show informs the audience that Homer lost 5% of his brain function permanently during the coma. 5%. Gone. Destroyed. The doctor explains this to Homer's family, and Homer's response to learning that he has sustained permanent brain damage is to laugh, Even though he mentions in that same moment that he does not understand why he is laughing, the family finds this charming. No one finds it alarming. The episode ends, the series continues. 32 more years of episodes follow, and the show proceeds as though nothing of significance occurred. Unless nothing did occur. Unless Homer never woke up at all. This is the coma theory. The basic premise, originally developed in online fan communities, is simple and devastating. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every guest appearance, every impossible adventure and inexplicable reset, is a dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him. The evidence for this interpretation is considerable, and it builds in a way that becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss. The most fundamental piece of evidence is tonal. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not strictly realistic, it was always a cartoon. Always satirical, always heightened. But the storylines dealt with recognizable human situations. Homer tries to stop drinking. Marge wrestles with the temptation of an affair. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher. Bart faces the real possibility of being held back a year in school. These are everyday family problems told through satire, rooted in the kinds of situations real families actually encounter. Financial anxiety, marital tension, academic failure. The emotional core of the show was built on something relatable. After the coma, everything changes. The shift is not subtle. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante organization. Homer joins a secret fraternal society with ancient rituals and hidden underground facilities. Homer discovers that his mother, believed dead for decades, is actually alive and living as a fugitive radical. Homer meets God. Then Homer meets God again. The show moves from a family sitcom grounded in economic anxiety and domestic friction to something where the main character has met multiple sitting presidents, traveled across dozens of countries, held hundreds of different jobs over the course of the series, befriended celebrities across virtually every field of human endeavor, and survived physical trauma that would end the life of any real human being. The escalation is so dramatic, the tonal shift so pronounced, that the internet has been debating when The Simpsons changed for more than 20 years. Fans argue endlessly about when the show went wrong, when it lost the thread, when it became something different from what it was in its first few seasons. The coma theory offers a precise answer to this question. The Simpsons did not go wrong at a particular point in time. Homer's brain got worse, and the show we have been watching ever since is the dream of a deteriorating mind trying to keep the story alive. Here is the detail that adds a layer of genuine unease to the whole theory. 6 months before the coma episode, in the Season 4 premiere titled Homer the Heretic, Homer has a conversation with God. An actual face-to-face conversation depicted literally within the episode. And during that conversation, God tells Homer that he will one day understand the meaning of life, but that the time for that understanding has not yet arrived. God tells Homer his time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline matches precisely. The Season 4 premiere establishes that Homer's conscious life is approaching some kind of end. The 18th episode of that same season depicts that end arriving. And the show then continues for decades of increasingly surreal and implausible content that the theory reads as the output of a mind in decline. Under a straightforward viewing, this is a funny theological throwaway moment followed by an unrelated medical emergency in a later episode. Under the coma theory, it is a prophecy. God was telling Homer that his waking life was almost over and that what followed would be something else entirely. The aging problem is where the coma theory does something no other explanation manages with the same elegance. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old since 1989. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not accumulated a single visible year on their faces. The show uses what is called a floating timeline, meaning the characters exist in a permanent present tense. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When one aired in 1997, they were living in 1997. The year surrounding them changes. The technology changes. The cultural references shift. The characters do not. Every theory about The Simpsons has to grapple with this. The radiation theory proposes that the cellular mutations from nuclear exposure have somehow suspended or disrupted normal aging processes. The standard industry explanation is that this is just how long-running animated shows work, a narrative convenience that audiences accept by convention. The coma theory has the simplest and most emotionally resonant answer. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man who went under in April 1993 and has not woken up since. Of course, his children do not age. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them growing up because he was not there to witness it happen. His wife does not age because the last time he truly saw her, she looked exactly as she does in every episode. His friends and neighbors do not change because his memory of them is fixed at the moment the vending machine fell. Homer's coma dream preserves his world exactly as it existed on the day he lost consciousness, because that is what comas do. They trap the mind in the last moment of waking experience and build everything that follows from that frozen foundation. The celebrity appearances that begin flooding the show in later seasons make complete sense under this reading. Homer's unconscious mind, lying in a hospital bed for years, is receiving ambient information from the world outside. Sounds from a television in the corner of the room, fragments of conversation from family members at his bedside, music playing in the hallway, the names and voices of famous people filtering through the fog of unconsciousness. And Homer's dreaming brain, desperate to maintain the simulation of a living world, absorbs these fragments and incorporates them into the dream. Every celebrity who shows up in Springfield is, according to this theory, a voice Homer heard somewhere in the background of his hospital room, translated by his deteriorating mind into a dream character that populates his imagined world. The increasingly surreal and physically impossible nature of the show's later seasons fits this pattern. Dreams do not maintain logical consistency over time. They shift and escalate. They introduce elements that have no grounding in physical reality. The earlier seasons of The Simpsons feel more grounded because they were generated by a mind that was healthier, still close to the waking world. The later seasons feel stranger and more disconnected because the mind generating them has been unconscious longer, has lost more function, has drifted further from the rational constraints of a waking brain. The show itself engaged with this theory, which tells you something about how seriously the writers take it. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout became the center of a significant piece of media surrounding a supposed deleted scene. The scene depicted Homer waking up from a long coma, with a framing device suggesting that every outlandish episode of the series had been a dream. This was presented publicly as a real leak, a genuine hidden scene that had been discovered. The show's producers then revealed that it was a hoax, a deliberately planted fake scene, not an actual deleted sequence. Hackers had planted it, the story went. It was not real. But the fact that it was made at all, that someone animated a full scene depicting Homer waking from a coma, and that this scene was compelling enough to generate genuine widespread discussion about whether it might be authentic, tells you something significant. The writers know the theory. They have engaged with it at a level detailed enough to produce a fully realized visual version of its conclusion. And their denial, their dismissal of it as a planted hoax, was delivered inside an episode that explicitly showed the thing they were denying. They depicted Homer waking up from a coma and then said it was not real. The show's executive producer addressed the theory directly in an interview in 2015 and stated plainly that it was not true. But what that dismissal did not address was the tonal shift after season 4. It did not explain why the show becomes progressively more surreal and untethered from realistic consequence as it continues. It did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. It did not explain why nobody ages. The denial was a statement without supporting reasoning, and the fans who built the theory noticed that gap. The coma theory does something that the official denial did not bother to do. It makes the entire show make sense. Every element of The Simpsons that seems inconsistent or implausible under a straightforward reading becomes coherent under this interpretation. The aging freeze is explained, the tonal shift is explained, the celebrity flood is explained, the increasingly cartoonish plots are explained. The reset button that erases all consequences between episodes is explained, because nothing is actually happening to Homer's body. His body is in a hospital bed. The drama, the injury, the adventure, the resolution, all of it exists only in his mind, and his mind can generate any story it wants without ever truly threatening him, because it is the one doing the telling. And then there is the emotional core of the theory, which is the part that stays with you. If the coma theory is true, then The Simpsons is not a comedy. It is a tragedy wearing the costume of one. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his unconscious mind is spending every moment of its remaining function trying to preserve and protect, is not adventure or success or recognition. It is his family. It is Marge still being there, still patient, still married to him. It is Bart still being young and mischievous and small enough that Homer's strangling hands can reach around his neck. It is Lisa still playing her saxophone in her room on Sunday evenings. It is Maggie still fitting in his arms. Homer wants Friday night on Evergreen Terrace to last forever. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives him exactly what he wants. His family preserved, his children never growing up to leave, his wife never leaving, the house always the same house, the beer always cold, the couch always there, the show never ending, because the ending would mean Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has actually passed, how old his children really are now, in the world outside the dream. Whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting by his bed in that hospital room in Springfield General, or whether the worst possibility has already happened, and he is not going to wake up at all. The coma theory does not ruin The Simpsons. It reframes it as something more honest than a comedy has any right to be. Every episode becomes an act of love, from an unconscious man to the family he cannot reach. Every impossible survival, every world reset, every time the credits roll and everything is exactly as it was before, it is not lazy writing, and it is not cartoon convention. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the simulation finally runs out of fuel, if the dream stops, then Homer has to face whatever comes next. And the dream, however strange and escalating and detached from reality it has become, is still better than that. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since April 1993. Every episode you have watched since then is a love letter from a man in a hospital bed to the family he cannot hold. The show will never confirm this officially, but it has never disproved it either, because the evidence is not an external imposition on the text. It is woven into the structure of the show itself. Nobody ages, reality keeps getting stranger, and Homer always finds his way home by the end of every episode, because in his dream he never left. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The case that was closed, not solved. Before we begin this section, I want to be direct about something. The show told you Maggie did it. Season 7, Episode 1. The investigation concluded, Burns identified his attacker, and the official verdict has been on the books for 30 years. A baby. Case closed. But the case was never really closed, and the more carefully you examine the evidence, the more the official answer starts to look less like a conclusion and more like a convenience. What follows is not a claim that Maggie is innocent. It is an argument that the evidence the show presented does not actually prove she is guilty, and that several pieces of that evidence point somewhere considerably more complicated. Let's go back to the beginning. Season 6, Episode 25. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. Summer 1995. The Simpsons did something that had never been attempted by an animated television series. It staged a genuine mystery, a whodunit designed with enough deliberate craft that the show's creators invited the entire American viewing audience to participate in a contest to guess the shooter. The winner would be animated into a future episode. Fox promoted the event like a cultural phenomenon. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted, treating the fictional crime as though it were a real, unsolved case. The Simpsons that summer was not just a television show. It was a national puzzle box. The setup required establishing motive, and the show did this with extraordinary thoroughness. Burns had gone too far, even by his own considerable standards. He had seized an oil well discovered beneath Springfield Elementary, destroying the school's budget. He had used the resulting financial leverage to bankrupt Moe's Tavern. He had created a sinkhole that collapsed the Springfield retirement castle. He had injured Santa's little helper, and for his culminating act, he built a device capable of blocking the sun over the entire town. Not as a threat, as policy. Burns blocked out Springfield's sunlight so that every resident would be forced to purchase electricity from his power plant. He eliminated the free energy source to ensure dependence on the paid one. When Smithers, Burns's most devoted employee, the man who had spent decades protecting Burns from the consequences of his own decisions, finally objected, Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of Part 1, Every significant character in the show had a documented reason to want Burns dead or at least seriously harmed. Homer, because Burns had been unable to remember his name for years despite Homer working directly for him. Bart and Lisa, because the school had lost its funding. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his job in the disruption. Tito Puente, because Burns eliminated the music program. Moe, because his bar went under. Even Smithers, freshly fired and clearly in psychological crisis. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns directly, and multiple characters were shown at that meeting carrying weapons. The tension was such that violence seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Then Burns collapsed, a gunshot wound. He staggered to the town sundial, fell against it, and his hands came to rest on two letters, W and S, or, from Burns's own perspective, looking up at the letters from the ground, M and S. The ambulance came. Burns was taken to the hospital. The screen went dark, and America spent the entire summer trying to figure out who pulled the trigger. When Part 2 aired in September, the investigation became a comedic procedural. Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police fumbled through the case with characteristic incompetence. Smithers confessed immediately but was exonerated when it emerged he had been blackout drunk at the time of the shooting and had actually discharged his weapon at a completely different person in a completely different location. His confession was sincere but factually impossible. One by one, the suspects were cleared. Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente had what is genuinely one of the more memorable alibis in television history. A full musical number demonstrating that he had channeled his rage into creative expression rather than violence. The investigation stalled until forensic evidence surfaced. An eyelash found on Burns's suit, DNA analysis matched it to a Simpson. This pointed directly at Homer, whose fingerprints were also found on a gun discovered in connection with the case. Homer had the clearest motive in the entire town. Burns had been unable to remember his name, repeatedly and pointedly, for years. Homer was arrested. He was close to being convicted. And then Burns woke up from his coma. He identified his attacker. It was Maggie. Baby Maggie Simpson. According to Burns, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot following the town meeting. He had attempted to take her lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. It discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Except, let's start with the contest. Because the contest reveals something important about the mechanics of this mystery. Fox invited the entire American viewing audience to submit their guesses for who shot Burns. Thousands upon thousands of entries arrived. According to the DVD commentary for these episodes, not a single person in the randomly selected sample of contest entries guessed the correct answer. Not one. The person awarded the prize was chosen at random from the pool of participants, and because they had not guessed correctly, they received a cash payment instead of the promised animated appearance in the show. The writers acknowledged on that same commentary that there was exactly one person known to have posted the correct answer online, on a Simpsons discussion forum, on the night of the original broadcast. One person out of an audience of millions guessed that Maggie had done it. But this person was using a college internet account, and by the time the contest concluded and the producers tried to identify them, the account was no longer active. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. This is worth sitting with. A mystery designed to be solvable from the clues in Part 1, promoted as a national puzzle with a significant prize, produced exactly one correct guess from an audience of millions. Either the clues were insufficient to lead a general audience to the correct answer, the red herrings were far more effective than the real evidence, or the answer did not follow as logically from the established clues as the show claimed it did. Any of those possibilities is worth taking seriously. Now examine the specific evidence. Burns falls against the sundial. His hands land on W and S, or from his perspective, M and S. The show presents this as pointing to Maggie Simpson. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But Burns himself, when describing the incident, stated explicitly that the positioning of his hands on those letters was not intentional. He was not deliberately spelling out his attacker's initials. He simply fell, and his hands landed where they landed. The sundial clue, the single most prominent piece of physical evidence used to build the case for Maggie's guilt, was described by the victim as a coincidence. The central physical clue in the mystery was acknowledged by its source to be meaningless. Then there is the gun. Burns carried a weapon in a holster. The show establishes, prior to the shooting, that Burns's holster was already empty. The gun was missing from his person before the attack occurred. This means that whoever shot Burns used his own weapon, taken from him at some point prior to the crime. This detail shapes the profile of the shooter in a significant way. A person who had brought their own weapon to the town meeting was there with the intention of potentially using it. But the person who shot Burns used Burns's own gun, which means they were not armed when they arrived. They encountered the gun by chance and used it impulsively. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. So does a substantial number of other Springfield residents who were not carrying weapons that evening. Burns's last words before being shot were, according to his account, a simple recognition. "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker. He was not startled. He was not afraid. He greeted the person in the way you greet someone familiar, someone you know well enough to recognize immediately but do not consider a threat. The phrase suggests a relationship of some duration, or at least a memorable prior encounter. The show does not establish a meaningful relationship between Burns and Maggie before this episode. Burns struggles to remember the name of Homer Simpson, who has worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would see a baby and respond with calm familiarity, as though recognizing an acquaintance, sits uncomfortably alongside everything the show has established about how Burns processes his employees and their families. Then, much later, in season 18, Homer makes a statement that the show does not pursue or examine. He claims, apparently without irony, that he was the one who shot Burns. He says this on camera. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer Simpson casually confesses to the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield, and the show treats it as a throwaway line and moves on. Either Homer is lying for reasons related to his character, which is entirely possible, or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer knows it because he is the one who actually fired the weapon. If the latter is true, then Maggie was blamed for something her father did. An infant was assigned responsibility for a crime committed by an adult, and the evidence used to establish that guilt, the DNA eyelash which belonged to a Simpson but not necessarily to Maggie specifically, the sundial positioning that Burns himself dismissed as accidental, and Burns's identification testimony delivered by a man who had just emerged from a serious coma, was either manufactured, misinterpreted, or accepted with significantly less scrutiny than it deserved. One of the most coherent alternative theories involves Marge. The case for Marge as the shooter is quieter than the case for Homer, but it addresses the evidence more thoroughly. Marge witnessed Burns destroy her children's school and eliminate the programs that mattered most to her family. She watched Burns injure the family dog. She watched Burns steal the sun from her town. She had clear and powerful motive. She is a devoted mother whose family was systematically damaged by one man's greed. And crucially, Burns fell in love with Marge in a season 3 episode. He was infatuated with her, which would explain something that no other version of events adequately accounts for. Burns woke up from his coma and identified his attacker as Maggie. Why would Burns, a man of precisely calculated self-interest, not identify the actual shooter? The Marge theory suggests that Burns recognized Marge, took the bullet from her, and then deliberately protected her by pointing to the one person in Springfield who could never be prosecuted. He looked at a baby and said, yes, it was the baby, because he could not bring himself to name the woman he loved, and because naming a baby meant naming someone the legal system would be constitutionally unable to punish. Chief Wiggum says it himself in the episode. No jury would convict a baby. Maggie was the perfect answer. Too young to deny the accusation, too young to be punished, and too young to understand what she was being accused of. If someone wanted to close the investigation cleanly while protecting the actual shooter, blaming Maggie was the most elegant available solution. The show knows this interpretation is valid, which is why the final shot of Part 2 is constructed the way it is. After everyone has left the room, Maggie is alone. She looks around to confirm that no one is watching. Then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. Maggie did it and she knows what she did. But you can read that exact sequence differently. A baby watching an adult perform an action and then imitating that action in private is not confession. It is mimicry. Babies observe and repeat. Maggie watched someone shoot Burns. She is imitating the motion she witnessed, because that is developmentally appropriate behavior for a 1-year-old. She is not confessing. She is remembering. The alternate endings go even further in undermining the certainty of the official answer. A complete, fully produced alternate conclusion to this mystery was animated in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter, not a rough sketch. A finished, voiced, complete version of the episode with a different ending. This was shown in The Simpsons' 138th episode Spectacular, hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses it by noting that accepting Smithers as the shooter would require ignoring all the Simpson DNA evidence, which would be, in his words, downright nutty. This dismissal is itself a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, in which a jury acquitted a defendant despite significant DNA evidence pointing to his guilt. The show is winking at its audience. It is saying explicitly that ignoring DNA evidence is something that happens, and that the official answer is not necessarily the right one just because it was accepted. Early drafts had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously enough to develop it before abandoning it. The point is that the answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was built backward from a conclusion, which means the evidence was arranged to support Maggie's guilt after the fact, not discovered in the process of genuinely investigating what happened. The question that nobody asks about this mystery is perhaps the most revealing one. In a town where every single resident had motive, where dozens of people arrived at the town meeting carrying weapons, where Burns had just stolen the sun from the entire community, how is it possible that only one person acted? Springfield is not a town known for restraint. These people form mobs over trivial misunderstandings. They burn things down. When they are collectively angry, their anger tends to express itself collectively. But when Burns commits arguably the most egregious act in the town's history, only one shot is fired. Only one person, whoever that person actually is, decided to act. Either Springfield's population was significantly more controlled on that particular evening than the show has ever portrayed them otherwise, or the shooting was not a spontaneous individual act. Maybe it was planned. Maybe the person who did it had access to Burns's schedule, knowledge of where his gun was kept, and enough influence or proximity to redirect the investigation toward a suspect who could never face consequences. Smithers knew Burns's every move. He was fired that day, angry and in crisis. Homer had reached a documented breaking point over Burns's inability to remember his name. Marge had watched her family be systematically targeted, and there are characters the show never seriously considered, people operating in the background of Springfield who had resources and reasons that the narrative never bothered to examine. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The show committed to it. The DVD commentary defends it. But the contest that nobody won, the sundial clue that Burns himself called accidental, the alternate endings that were fully produced, Homer's unexamined confession decades later, and the final shot of Maggie imitating a trigger pull in an empty room, taken together, they suggest something the show has quietly maintained for 30 years. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was not solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those have always been two very different things. End of Part 1 file. Section 4. How is Mr. Burns still alive? The architecture of immortality. This is not a rhetorical question. It is not a joke about cartoon logic. Within the established canon of The Simpsons, across every episode that has ever aired, Charles Montgomery Burns represents something that has no explanation in any conventional biological framework. His age has been stated, implied, and contradicted across dozens of episodes. But every version of the timeline, however you construct it, places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has spoken of events from the 19-teens as first-hand experience, not as history he learned, but as life he lived. He has described professional relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is more than 100 years old. By the most expansive reading of the show's internal timeline, he might be approaching 140, and he does not merely exist at that age, he functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal politics with precision. He orchestrates schemes that require sustained cognitive effort, long-term strategic planning, and a working comprehension of modern technology, modern finance, and contemporary law. His body has become catastrophically frail, yes. His physical strength is essentially non-existent. A slight breeze in the wrong direction appears capable of knocking him over. But his mind, by every indication the show provides, remains razor-sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a calculated ruthlessness that nobody else in the town can match. And he has been operating at that level for longer than any human being should be capable of sustaining conscious, purposeful thought. The show addresses his longevity directly, even if it does not acknowledge what it is addressing. In the Springfield Files, we establish that Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive that it causes his body to emit visible light. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days, and then he needs another dose. Without the next treatment, Burns dies. The show presents this as an explanation for why Homer saw a glowing figure in the woods, and then moves on. But the implications of what has been established are far larger than the episode bothers to explore. Burns is not surviving through any natural biological process. He is being sustained artificially through a recurring medical intervention administered on a precise weekly schedule. Missing a single treatment is not inconvenient or harmful. Missing a single treatment is fatal. His life is maintained the way you maintain a machine, through scheduled servicing, with zero tolerance for deviation from that schedule. The margin for error is not small. The margin for error is 0. And the treatment itself involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns the facility that has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's water supply and soil and air for decades is personally dependent on controlled, carefully administered radiation exposure to sustain his own biology. Burns is not simply profiting from radiation. Burns is powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by his proximity to nuclear material over such an extended period that it can no longer sustain its own cellular processes through normal means. He requires external radiation input the way a normal human being requires food and water. Without it, within a week, his system shuts down. This explains something the show depicts repeatedly without ever addressing directly: Burns's immune status. In one of the most quoted scenes in the entire series, Burns visits a doctor who delivers a remarkable diagnosis. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one, simultaneously present in his body at the same time. The doctor explains that the diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium within Burns, each one canceling out the others. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome, comparing it to 3 people trying to push through a doorway simultaneously. None of them can move. They are all blocked by each other. Burns's diseases are all attempting to kill him at once, and because they are all present at once, none of them can actually progress. The biological gridlock prevents any single illness from gaining dominance. The doctor's conclusion is that Burns is simultaneously the sickest man in the United States and functionally indestructible, because everything that should kill him is being blocked by everything else that should kill him. This scene is played as comedy, and it is genuinely funny as written. But the radiation theory provides an underlying logic that the joke version does not bother to supply. Burns's body is not maintaining this disease equilibrium through any natural process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. They are not curing his diseases. They are managing them, keeping every illness in a precise and precarious stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from breaking through and ending him. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is functioning like a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control mechanisms to prevent a catastrophic failure. The moment those adjustments stop, everything collapses at once. Smithers is not simply a devoted assistant in this framework. He is, in a very practical sense, Burns's life support system. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every weekly appointment without exception. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that exceeds anything you would expect from professional loyalty alone. The show has established across multiple episodes that if Smithers were ever removed from his position, if he left or was fired or became unable to perform his duties, Burns would be in immediate physical danger. Not because Burns is emotionally dependent on Smithers, though that relationship is also present. Because without Smithers managing the treatment schedule, Burns would miss a dose. The disease equilibrium that has kept him alive for over a century would collapse. Every illness in his body would surge simultaneously. Smithers' devotion to Burns is not explained purely by affection or professional loyalty or any emotional bond, though those are all present. It is also explained by the fact that Smithers is the only person who fully understands how Burns's medical protocol functions. His absence is a death sentence. He knows this. And that knowledge is the true foundation beneath the more visible layers of their relationship. Now consider the historical dimension of Burns's longevity. The show has placed Burns in personal proximity to an extraordinary range of historical moments. He attended Yale. He served in some capacity during World War II, a service the show characterizes as morally complicated at minimum, including the detail that Burns stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and kept it hidden for decades. He knew Howard Hughes. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as something he studied, but as something he experienced. His personal recollections span more than a century of American history, and they are consistent with someone who was present for that history, rather than someone who learned it afterward. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The Burns dynasty, as the show depicts it in scattered references across its run, is one of the oldest, continuously powerful lineages in American history. They did not simply accumulate wealth at some point in the 19th century. They have been shaping the infrastructure and economy of their region for generations, building systems of dependence, ensuring that their prosperity is structurally embedded in the prosperity of everyone around them, so that challenging the Burns family means threatening your own livelihood. The question the show never explicitly poses is whether Burns is unique in his longevity, or whether his family has always found methods to extend their lives beyond the normal human span. If the current Burns has survived past 100 years through artificial medical intervention, is it possible that previous Burns patriarchs employed different methods appropriate to their era? Before nuclear radiation, before modern medicine, before the technologies that currently sustain him, did earlier generations of the Burns family pursue other strategies for maintaining their hold on power and their grip on life? The show does not answer this, but it establishes, across multiple references, that the Burns family has maintained continuous control of its fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity does not emerge from normal generational succession and ordinary luck. It implies either extraordinary institutional mechanisms for transferring and maintaining power, or something more personal to the individuals at the top of that dynasty. Burns's relationship with death is also worth examining on its own terms. He has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show's history. He was shot by Maggie Simpson and survived. He has been hospitalized for injuries and illnesses that would be terminal for any ordinary person. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been poisoned, been abandoned in wilderness without supplies or assistance, and every single time, he returns. Not through the cartoon resilience that allows Homer to survive impossible physical trauma. Burns does not shrug off damage. He sustains it, and then the machinery of wealth and medical infrastructure closes around him and rebuilds him. Homer's survival is passive. The show needs Homer to survive, and so Homer survives. Burns's survival is engineered. He has spent more than a century constructing a system specifically designed to ensure that no matter what happens to his physical form, there will always be the resources, the personnel, and the specialized knowledge available to keep him alive. Every dollar he has accumulated, every institution he has corrupted, every politician he has acquired, every doctor he has retained on private contract, all of it serves one ultimate function. Keep Burns alive, keep the treatments coming, keep the diseases in balance, keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, the empire dies with him. And empires, the show implies, do not allow themselves to die. The most unsettling dimension of the Burns immortality theory is not the possibility that he might continue to live indefinitely. It is the relationship between his survival and Springfield's. The town's economy is structured around the power plant. The power plant depends entirely on Burns's continued ownership and management. Burns depends on the weekly treatments. The treatments depend on the infrastructure that Burns's wealth provides. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system in which the man, the machine, and the money feed each other in continuous circulation. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without him. And Burns cannot die because dying would mean the system he spent a century constructing would finally have to answer for what it has done to the people inside it. Burns is not immortal. The show never quite says he is. What the show depicts instead is something more practically disturbing. Burns is too expensive to die. The investment in his continued survival is so enormous. so deeply embedded in so many interconnected systems that the cost of allowing him to die exceeds the cost of keeping him alive indefinitely. Springfield will keep paying that cost in contaminated water and irradiated air and cognitive damage and political corruption for as long as Burns keeps the lights on. And if his treatment schedule holds, that could be forever. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper. Springfield's Machinery of Denial. There is an episode of The Simpsons that fans have hated for almost 30 years. Not disliked, not found disappointing. Actively hated, with a consistency and intensity unusual even among the show's most debated entries. It is ranked among the worst episodes in the series. Its writer has expressed regret about it publicly. The voice actor who plays the character at its center went on record criticizing the storyline. Critics cited it as evidence that the show had lost its way. And fans for nearly 3 decades have pointed to it as the moment The Simpsons stopped caring about its own continuity. The episode is Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. It aired the 28th of September 1997. And the argument I want to make tonight is that this episode did not break The Simpsons. It diagnosed it. It is not the worst episode of the series. It might be the most important one. Because it is the only episode in 36 years that showed you, explicitly and in real time, the mechanism behind Springfield's impossible amnesia, the machinery that makes the town forget, the social infrastructure that allows catastrophic events to happen and then simply not be remembered by the following week. Here is what happens in the episode. Springfield Elementary holds a celebration honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the event, a stranger enters. He is unfamiliar to everyone present. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was taken prisoner during the conflict, presumed dead, and then actually escaped and survived and made his way home. He has returned to find that someone else has been living his life for the past 2 decades. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner is an imposter. His real name is Armand Tamzarian. Before the war, Tamzarian was a petty criminal with no prospects, drafted into the army and placed in the same unit as the actual Seymour Skinner. When Skinner was captured and reported as killed in action, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother, Agnes. But Agnes, upon seeing him, assumed he was her son returned. She needed him to be her son. She was grieving and desperate for the loss to be undone. And Tamzarian, who had never had a family, never had a home, never had a name worth keeping, allowed the assumption to stand. He became Seymour Skinner. He lived inside that stolen identity for 20 years, becoming a principal, establishing relationships, building a life and a name that was never his, until the real Skinner walked back through the door. The truth is now fully exposed. Everyone in Springfield knows the principal is not who he said he was. The actual Seymour Skinner is standing in the room. The community has definitive, irrefutable proof that a major public figure has been operating under a false identity for 2 decades. And then Springfield holds a meeting to decide what to do about this information. The town does not vote on whether to prosecute Tamzarian. They do not vote on whether to restore the real Skinner's name and life to him. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. And the verdict is unanimous. They choose the lie. They choose the comfortable, familiar fiction over the inconvenient, disruptive truth. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree. The imposter is to be legally recognized as the real Skinner, going forward in perpetuity. The actual Seymour Skinner, the decorated war veteran who survived a prisoner of war camp and returned to find his identity occupied by someone else, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal to mention the truth under penalty of torture. Let that sequence of events settle. A town collectively and deliberately chose to sustain a lie. They had the real version of a person standing in front of them, confirmed by his own name and military records, and they chose the fake version instead. They sentenced the truth to exile. They made speaking the truth a criminal offense. They gave the fiction a legal foundation. And then, as Springfield always does, they went back to their lives as though the whole thing had never happened. Fans hated this. The criticism was immediate and fierce. The objections were reasonable. The episode seemed to destroy Skinner's character by revealing that everything established about him over 8 seasons was built on a fictional foundation. His military service, his relationship with his mother, his dynamic with Bart, his position in the school. None of it was real. All of it belonged to someone else. The show seemed to be throwing away a character the audience had invested in, for no apparent narrative reason, in a way that could not be undone. But here is what the critical response consistently missed. The episode is not inventing a new behavior for Springfield. It is showing you a behavior that Springfield has been performing since the first season, in an episode that is explicit and direct about what that behavior actually is. Springfield has always done this. The town has always chosen comfortable fictions over uncomfortable truths. The town has always agreed to forget whatever does not serve the current narrative. The town has always expelled, ignored, or silenced anyone who insisted on saying something that the collective preferred not to hear. The only difference with the principal and the pauper is that the show let you watch it happen. It showed you the vote, it showed you the legal decree, it showed you the physical removal of the true thing from the community. Every other time Springfield forgets something catastrophic, every other time the status quo resets after a world-changing event, it happens between episodes, off-screen, without ceremony. One week something enormous occurs. The next week everything is as it was before, and nobody references the enormous thing. This episode is the exception. This is the one time the show put the amnesia mechanism on screen and let the audience see exactly how it works. Consider the full catalog of things Springfield has experienced and subsequently forgotten. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It has experienced nuclear near misses at the power plant. It has dealt with environmental catastrophes of the kind that would generate decades of legal proceedings in any real jurisdiction. It has had alien contact. It has had its sunlight blocked by a billionaire's personal device. It has hosted events so extraordinary that any one of them would permanently alter the psychology of the community that lived through it. And every single time by the following episode, the slate is clean. Nobody remembers. Nobody references the previous event. The trauma did not happen. The catastrophe is gone. The common explanation for this is that it is episodic storytelling. Each episode is self-contained. Continuity between episodes is not required by the format. This is true as a production reality, but the principal and the pauper suggest something more interesting than a production decision. It suggests that Springfield's amnesia is not a narrative convenience. It is a choice the community makes together, deliberately, because the alternative is too dangerous. The episode shows you what happens when Springfield is forced to confront a truth it has been suppressing. The real Seymour Skinner walks in with proof, and the community's immediate response is not gratitude for the truth. It is panic. It is the recognition that the truth, if acknowledged, would require dismantling something that has become comfortable and load-bearing. And then it is the vote to keep the lie, because the lie is safer than the truth. Think about what the truth would require Springfield to confront if the town were capable of sustained honesty about its own history. If they remembered the dome, they would have to acknowledge the pollution. Acknowledging the pollution means examining the power plant. Examining the power plant means challenging Burns. Challenging Burns means threatening the economic foundation that the entire town depends on. The whole structure falls. So they do not remember the dome. They do not discuss the pollution. They never challenge Burns. The loop continues. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's test case for what happens when someone arrives with documented proof that the official narrative is false. He came with evidence. He came with his name, his records, his history. He was standing proof that the man running the school was not who he claimed to be. And the town's response was to tie him to a train and make it illegal to mention his existence. That is not a comedy beat constructed for a bad episode of a long-running animated series. That is the show explicitly depicting the mechanism by which a community suppresses inconvenient truth. The process by which an entire population agrees, without explicit discussion, to treat the lie as reality and the reality as criminal. It is showing you, clearly and directly, how Springfield maintains its impossible equilibrium in the face of overwhelming evidence that something is very wrong. And if the coma theory is true, this episode takes on a dimension that goes beyond institutional commentary. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire town votes to sustain a lie and makes it a crime to tell the truth, and physically ejects the truth from the community, because that is what Homer needs to believe is possible. He needs to believe that a stolen identity can become real through collective agreement. He needs to believe that a fake version of a life can replace the real one and be accepted as genuine by everyone who witnesses it. He needs to believe that the mechanism of collective denial is strong enough to keep inconvenient truths permanently at bay. Because Homer's coma is, itself, a fake life replacing a real one, a dream masquerading as waking experience. And as long as Springfield keeps voting to maintain the fiction, as long as the collective agreement holds, Homer never has to face the reality of what has happened to him. The Principal and the Pauper is not a bad episode. It is the most self-aware episode the show has produced. It is the one moment in 36 years of television where The Simpsons stopped performing its own mechanics and showed them to you instead. The machinery behind every reset. The social contract beneath every forgotten catastrophe. The infrastructure of denial that keeps Springfield functioning despite everything it has been through and everything it has refused to acknowledge. Armin Tamzarian is still calling himself Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. And the real Seymour Skinner is still out there somewhere, exiled from his own life, the last honest man in a town that made honesty a criminal offense. Section 6. Maggie Simpson. The most dangerous person in Springfield. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She does not walk reliably. She communicates primarily through pacifier movements and the occasional pointed stare. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She is the smallest, the quietest, the least visible member of a family that is in constant, loud, chaotic motion around her. And she is, without question, the most capable person on Evergreen Terrace. Let's establish the record first, because the record is more extensive than most viewers remember. Maggie shot a billionaire. She organized and led a rebellion against a tyrannical daycare caretaker. She has rescued family members from immediate physical danger on multiple occasions. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that consistently exceed those of the adult characters around her. She was formally tested and found to possess intelligence that registers as extraordinary by any available measure. She saved her family from situations that the adults were completely incapable of resolving. And through all of it, every remarkable thing she has ever done, she has maintained her silence. She has not spoken. She has not drawn attention to what she is capable of. She has sat in her carrier, or crawled across the floor, or sucked on her pacifier, and let the world around her assume she is exactly what she appears to be. Let's start with the shooting. We have already examined the mystery of who shot Burns at length. Whether or not Maggie was the one who actually fired the weapon, the aftermath of that determination is what reveals her character most clearly. A baby was identified as the person responsible for shooting the richest and most powerful man in Springfield. The investigation concluded. The evidence was examined, and the official verdict was that yes, this infant committed an act of violence against an adult, and there is nothing the legal system can do about it. Chief Wiggum's exact words confirm this. No jury in the world would convict a baby. The case was closed. Maggie faced no consequences. But look at the final shot of the episode. After everyone has left the room, Maggie is alone. She checks her surroundings. She looks left, she looks right. She confirms that no one is watching, and then, only once she has verified her solitude, she moves her pacifier in a motion that deliberately mimics pulling a trigger. Assess that sequence of behaviors independently of the shooting mystery. What Maggie performs in that moment is not reflexive behavior. It is not random movement. A baby performing a deliberate check of her environment before repeating a private behavior demonstrates situational awareness, memory of a prior event, understanding that the behavior has social consequences that require management, and the impulse control to suppress that behavior in the presence of observers. These are not traits associated with normal infant development. These are traits associated with someone who understands exactly what they did, understands that others would respond to that action, and has decided that concealment is the appropriate strategy. She waited until she was alone. She verified her solitude. Then she reenacted the action privately. That is not a baby doing something reflexive. That is someone exercising discretion. The Longest Daycare is a theatrical short released in 2012, screened before Ice Age, Continental Drift in cinemas, and nominated for an Academy Award. It is 7 minutes of Maggie Simpson demonstrating intelligence that would be remarkable in a fully grown adult, operating through a body that can barely maintain an upright position. The premise is simple. Maggie is at the Ayn Rand School for Tots. She encounters a caterpillar about to become a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Gerald, a baby bully she has encountered in previous episodes, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature suspense film in which Maggie outmaneuvers Gerald, the daycare staff, the facility's internal security architecture, and a series of obstacles that would challenge a reasonably intelligent adult. She reads the environment. She identifies threats and their patrol patterns. She develops strategies on the fly and adapts them when circumstances change. She executes multi-step plans that require timing, spatial reasoning, and the ability to accurately predict the behavior of other individuals. She does all of this while physically limited to the motor capacities of a 1-year-old. Her body falls. It stumbles. It moves with the uncertain coordination of someone who has not yet mastered bipedal locomotion. But her decision-making is precise. Every choice she makes in the short is the correct choice given available information. Every move is optimized toward her goal. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support, and she succeeds through the intelligence alone, compensating for every limitation her body imposes. She solves the problem without speaking, without assistance, without any resource except the environment around her and her own capacity to understand it. Then she watches the butterfly go free and accepts the loss of her shoe, which was used as a distraction device, with something that looks, in a baby, strikingly like composed satisfaction. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly in various episodes. The results vary depending on what the story requires, but the pattern across them is consistent. Maggie is not a normal baby. Her cognitive function registers as extraordinary when measured. The show plays this for quick jokes and moves on, because that is the show's way of handling things it does not want to fully examine. But the accumulation of these moments across 36 seasons is impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Maggie consistently demonstrates capabilities that no 1-year-old should possess. And her defining characteristic through all of this is not the intelligence, it is the silence. Her first word was spoken once, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in a cameo appearance, and never repeated. In 36 years of continuous narrative, Maggie has not developed language in any meaningful way. She communicates through gesture and expression and the occasional sound. She is surrounded by a family of extraordinarily verbal people. Homer talks constantly, Marge talks constantly, Bart never stops making noise, Lisa never stops articulating her thoughts. The Simpson household is a wall of continuous conversation, and Maggie sits in the middle of it, watching everything, hearing everything, processing everything, and contributing nothing audible. The theory is that her silence is not developmental delay. It is strategy. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is a genius, and her intelligence has gotten her isolation, dismissal, and a lifetime of fighting for recognition from a family and community that does not particularly want to be challenged. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. Lisa challenges authority and gets punished. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and meets the combined weight of a community that has structured itself around not improving. Lisa's intelligence is visible, announced, worn on the outside, and the response is consistent. The room makes sure she understands how little it matters. Maggie watched this happen. She has watched it since the day she was born, lying in her carrier in the same house where Lisa has been fighting every day for acknowledgement and receiving nothing but resistance in return. Maggie watched the smartest member of the family be consistently undervalued, overlooked, and made to feel that her intelligence was a problem rather than a gift. And Maggie drew a different conclusion from the same evidence. If visibility is the mechanism by which Springfield punishes intelligence, then invisibility is the armor against that punishment. If announcing yourself as the most capable person in the room results in the room turning against you, then not announcing it, ever, results in something else entirely. Maggie's silence is not an absence of something she should have. It is the presence of something she chose, a deliberate strategy, executed from an age before most children can articulate a preference, by a mind intelligent enough to recognize the situation it was born into and adapt accordingly. Consider what happens every time Maggie acts. She saves someone. She resolves a situation. She does something that should command attention. And what happens afterward? Nobody notices. The family moves on to the next crisis. The community never adjusts its assessment of her. The baby who shot a billionaire is still treated as an infant. The baby who led a daycare rebellion is still carried in a carrier everywhere. The baby who has demonstrably solved problems that stumped every adult around her is still handed a pacifier and placed in a playpen, because that is what Maggie designed. Every heroic act happens below the radar, in the margins, in the spaces where adults are not paying close attention. And Maggie ensures that nobody pays close attention by maintaining the most effective possible disguise. She pretends to be exactly what everyone assumes a baby is: quiet, passive, dependent, limited. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of all of them, and she has sustained this performance for 36 years without a single break in character. Connect this to the radiation theory, and the picture becomes sharper. The radiation theory proposes that the environmental contamination in Springfield produces mutations that affect different people in different ways. Homer's exposure, intensified by direct proximity to the reactor core, diminished his intelligence to a clinical disability level. But Maggie, born to parents already saturated in Springfield's contaminated environment, exposed from conception, represents something the theory reads as the opposite end of the mutation spectrum. Where the father's cognitive function was reduced, the daughter's was amplified. Homer and Maggie are two expressions of the same environmental cause. He is what happens when the mutation takes something away. She is what happens when it gives something extraordinary. Same contaminated water, same irradiated air, same family, same house, same Springfield, two opposite outcomes in the same generation. And if the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius takes on a dimension that is almost too heavy to hold comfortably. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode is the product of an unconscious mind preserving its family in amber, then Maggie's extraordinary capabilities are Homer's deepest hope for his youngest child, projected into the dream. He cannot see her grow up. He cannot watch her develop. He cannot hear her first full sentence or see her learn to run or witness what kind of person she becomes. He missed all of that in the hospital bed. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary before she can grow. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her developmental stage. He makes her capable of things no actual one-year-old could do, because in the dream he needs to believe that Maggie will be safe without him, that whatever he is failing to give her in his absence, she already has, that she will not need him to protect her, because she is already capable of protecting herself. Her genius is not a mutation. Under the coma theory, it is a father's prayer encoded in a dream. But in the waking Springfield, if there is still a waking Springfield, there is another reading, a darker one. Maggie does not speak because she has learned, from watching Lisa, that speaking gets you nothing in this town. She does not reveal her intelligence because intelligence is a liability in Springfield. She watches everything and remembers everything and understands everything. And she waits. For what? The show never tells us. Maggie's endgame is the last truly unresolved mystery in this family. She is the only character whose future the show has never definitively addressed, because to address it would require the show to acknowledge everything it has been building around her for 3.5 decades. She is 1 year old. She cannot walk without assistance. She cannot speak beyond a few sounds. She has no obvious resources, no political influence, no money, no allies beyond the family that consistently underestimates her. And she is the most dangerous person in Springfield. The things she has done are documented. She shot a man. She organized infants. She outwitted every adult who stood between her and a goal. She has confirmed or denied other characters' innocence with a single nod that the family accepts as authoritative. And every time, she retreats back into the disguise of helplessness and lets the world return to ignoring her. Something behind those enormous eyes is thinking. Something is planning. Something has been watching Springfield for 36 years with an intelligence nobody suspects and a patience nobody else in this family could sustain. And when Maggie finally decides to act at scale, when she decides the moment has arrived, Springfield will have no idea it is coming, because that is exactly what she designed. The most important strategic decision anyone in this family ever made was the decision a baby made before she could form words. Silence. End of Part 2 file. Section 7. The Simpsons predictions. Coincidence, satire, or something stranger? Let's get the famous ones out of the way first, because you have probably seen them shared online so many times that they have started to feel like wallpaper. The familiarity makes them easy to dismiss. But the familiarity is itself a piece of evidence worth examining, so let's look at each one carefully before we assess what the whole collection actually means. In the year 2000, the episode Bart to the Future depicted a future America in which Lisa Simpson had become the first female president of the United States. In that same episode, her predecessor in the Oval Office was identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired in early 2000. Trump won the presidential election in 2016. That is a 16-year gap between the joke and the reality it appeared to anticipate. When this connection was noticed, the response online was immediate and enormous. Screenshots circulated. The clip went viral. People who had not watched The Simpsons in years were suddenly sharing it and asking, with varying degrees of genuine bewilderment, how the writers could have known. The moment became the cornerstone of a broader cultural conversation about the show's apparent predictive capacity, and it launched 1,000 follow-up articles cataloging every other instance in which Springfield seemed to have gotten there first. The list is genuinely long. A 1,995 episode depicted a wristwatch that communicates digitally, predating the smartwatch by roughly 2 decades. Homer goes to space in a 1994 episode alongside Buzz Aldrin, long before commercial space tourism became a realistic possibility for civilian passengers. In a 1998 episode, a mathematical equation that appears on Homer's blackboard was later recognized by physicists as an approximation of the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was experimentally confirmed in 2012. In a 1999 episode, Homer develops a theory about the universe being shaped like a donut, and years afterward, cosmological research into radiation patterns produced data suggesting the universe might have a toroidal shape. A 1,993 episode called Margin Chains depicted a flu virus originating from Asia, spreading to Springfield, generating panic buying, overwhelmed medical systems, and a frantic public search for a treatment. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic, and in the chaos of that fictional outbreak, Springfield accidentally released a swarm of killer bees. This felt strange when Asian giant hornets, which the media immediately dubbed murder hornets, appeared in the United States during the actual 2020 pandemic. In 1996, the episode Homerpalooza featured a gag in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booked the London Symphony Orchestra for the same event. That specific collaboration actually occurred in 2024, when Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The gap between the joke and the reality was 28 years. A 1,998 episode depicted the Walt Disney Company acquiring 20th Century Fox. That acquisition actually occurred in 2019, 21 years after the episode aired. Across multiple episodes, across multiple decades, the show depicted video calling technology, failed autocorrect, and pervasive surveillance culture years before those things became standard features of everyday life. The natural response to this accumulation of apparent accuracy is to ask what is actually going on. Are the writers time travelers? Is the show operating from some source of genuine foresight? Is The Simpsons a prophetic text that has been hiding in plain sight as entertainment for 36 years? The people who actually make the show have a clear and consistent answer to these questions, and it is considerably less dramatic than any of those possibilities. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on The Simpsons for most of its run, has addressed the prediction phenomenon in multiple interviews. His explanation is deliberate and direct. When you throw enough darts, you are going to hit some bullseyes. That is the whole answer. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, observations, satirical references, and speculative extrapolations about American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, some of it will align with future events through sheer statistical probability. The hits become memorable. The misses, which are far more numerous, are forgotten. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its peak seasons, was even more direct. There are very few cases where The Simpsons predicted something. Mostly it is coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history has a tendency to repeat itself. Snopes and other fact-checking organizations have systematically examined the most widely shared prediction claims and found mundane explanations for most of them. Many of the supposed predictions are not predictions at all. They are observations of trends that were already visible when the episodes were written. The Trump prediction did not require foreknowledge. Trump had been publicly flirting with the idea of running for president since the late 1980s. He was a fixture of American celebrity culture with a long-documented interest in political visibility. The writers observed that celebrity culture and political culture were on a collision course and imagined the absurd logical conclusion of that trajectory. They wrote a joke about an obvious direction. Then America went in that direction. The Disney-Fox observation was similar. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The idea that major entertainment companies would continue to acquire each other until a small number of enormous corporations controlled most of the content landscape was not a prediction. It was the obvious next step of a trend that had been underway for decades. The smartwatch was not a prediction of a specific device. It was an extrapolation of the observable fact that technology was becoming smaller and more personal, with a logical endpoint being a computing device small enough to wear on your wrist. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most formally educated in television. Multiple writers hold degrees from Harvard, Princeton, and other elite institutions. Many have backgrounds in mathematics, physics, computer science, and political theory. These are people who spend their professional lives studying the mechanics of American culture, tracing the arcs of developing trends, and pushing those arcs to their absurd but internally logical conclusions. They are not guessing at the future. They are reading the present more carefully than most people do, and then extrapolating forward a few steps. But here is where it gets genuinely strange. Because most of the predictions are explainable through trend extrapolation and volume and statistical probability, and the fact-checkers are right that the confirmation bias of a massive audience filters the hits into prominence while allowing the misses to disappear. Most of the predictions work this way. Not all of them. Some of the coincidences are specific enough that trend extrapolation and statistical probability begin to feel inadequate. The Trump prediction did not just forecast that a celebrity might one day seek high political office. It identified Trump by name. And the episode depicted him descending an escalator in a visual sequence that closely mirrors the announcement he made in 2015 when he declared his presidential candidacy. That is a specific visual detail that was not in the trajectory of any general trend. That is a particular image replicated in a particular way. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just make a broad observation about the inherent danger of keeping large wild animals as performance partners. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers in a way that matches almost exactly what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of his act's white tigers. That is not a trend extrapolation. That is a specific scenario that occurred specifically. These cases are rare. They are far rarer than the collection of viral screenshots suggests. But they exist, and they resist the tidy statistical explanation more stubbornly than the others. This is where the meta-theory becomes more interesting than any conspiracy about foresight. The Simpsons does not predict the future through supernatural means or hidden information, but it may shape the future through cultural influence, and that influence is worth examining seriously. The show is one of the most watched, most quoted, most deeply embedded pieces of American media in the history of the medium. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its observations have become part of the framework through which Americans understand their own culture, their own political situation, their own relationship to power and corporate authority, and the absurdities of modern life. When The Simpsons makes a joke about something, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream of millions of people simultaneously. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people say and share and think about when they encounter the real version of the thing being joked about. The joke does not predict the reality. The joke makes the reality feel familiar when it arrives. When The Simpsons depicted a Trump presidency, that image spent 16 years in the cultural memory of everyone who saw it. When Trump actually ran, the moment his candidacy was announced, millions of people had an immediate reference point. They had seen this before. This had already been a joke. The cultural imagination had already processed this possibility, had already organized it into a recognizable shape, had already decided how to feel about it. The shock was muted because the familiarity was already there. The show did not predict the Disney-Fox merger. It made media consolidation feel like the punchline of an obvious joke for 2 decades. When the merger was announced, the cultural response was not disbelief. It was recognition. Of course they did. The Simpsons already told us this would happen. Satire does not forecast the future. Satire normalizes the future. It takes the direction things are heading and presents it as already arrived, so that when it actually arrives, it does not feel like a shocking development. It feels like the completion of something that was always going to happen. Springfield does not reflect America. America has been slowly becoming Springfield. The show held up a specific kind of mirror for 36 years, and in staring into that mirror, the culture began to organize itself around what it saw there. The corrupt billionaire who controls the essential infrastructure and faces no consequences. The incompetent government institutions that cannot act against concentrated power. The population too economically dependent on the existing structure to challenge it. The cycle of catastrophe and collective amnesia. Springfield was not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield was a diagnosis of where America already was, put into a form vivid enough and entertaining enough that the culture could absorb it without being threatened by it. And the final piece of this phenomenon is confirmation bias, which is the engine that transforms a large catalog of mixed results into something that feels like prophecy. The show has also made jokes that did not come true. Thousands of them. Jokes about jetpacks and lunar colonies and technologies that never materialized. Jokes about political outcomes that went other ways. Jokes about cultural shifts that never occurred. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody builds viral threads around predictions that failed. Nobody shares a clip from 1997 showing something the Simpsons got wrong. The failures disappear. The successes accumulate into a highlight reel that looks, from the outside, like systematic foresight. 800 episodes, 36 years. Thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American civilization, filtered through the confirmation bias engine of the internet, until only the accurate ones remain visible in the cultural memory. That is not prophecy. That is statistics plus confirmation bias, plus a show that has been running long enough that some of its jokes were eventually going to come true. But here is the honest admission that even the debunkers tend to quietly concede. Even knowing exactly how the trick works, even understanding the mechanism completely, it is still impressive to watch. 800 episodes, thousands of observations. Enough bullseyes that even the writers themselves, the people who understand exactly how the content was produced, occasionally pause when a 1997 clip lines up with a 2025 headline and feel something that is not quite certainty and not quite surprise. Because knowing why something happens does not always make it feel less remarkable when it happens. And The Simpsons, after all this time, still occasionally manages to produce that feeling. Section 8. Mona Simpson. The Mother, The Fugitive, and the Conspiracy that Broke 3 Generations. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson told Homer that his mother had passed away when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned. He grew up believing he was a boy whose mother died before he was old enough to understand why, and whose father was too emotionally closed to fill the absence she had left behind. That belief was not a detail the show noted and moved past. It was the substructure of Homer's entire character, his desperate need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his compulsive desire to be liked by everyone around him, his willingness to absorb humiliation and degradation from his employer rather than risk destabilizing the one stable thing in his life, his clinginess toward Marge, his need to be reassured of her love at regular intervals, his panic whenever anything threatens the domestic arrangement that anchors him. Homer Simpson's entire personality is, at its foundation, a coping mechanism constructed around maternal loss. And in Season 7, the show revealed that the loss was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired the 19th of November, 1995, and is widely considered one of the greatest single episodes in the show's entire run. The setup involves Homer faking his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, which is a classic Homer premise, played initially for comedy. But when Marge insists he correct the death record at the Hall of Records, Homer makes a discovery that upends everything. According to the municipal records he consults, his mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him was not hers. It belonged to a poet named Walt Whitman. Abe had been directing his son's grief at a stranger's headstone for the entirety of Homer's life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She does not recognize the adult version of the boy she left. He has grown and changed in her absence. He has become someone she does not immediately see in the man standing in front of her. But Homer proves who he is, and the reunion that follows is one of the most genuinely emotional scenes the show has ever produced. A grown man and the mother he thought was dead, finding each other beside a grave that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him the truth. She did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who would eventually employ Homer, the man whose facility Homer would spend his entire adult career working in, had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife in Springfield. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. She was living a quiet domestic life while the world outside was moving through the civil rights movement, the counterculture, the anti-war protests. Something changed. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists, people the show describes as hippies but whose cause the episode treats with more seriousness than that label implies. They targeted a biological weapons laboratory, a laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that sit for a moment. Burns did not merely own a nuclear power plant. He owned a facility dedicated to the production of biological weapons. A germ warfare laboratory, located in Springfield, in the same town where families were living their ordinary lives, surrounded by neighbors who had no idea that the richest man in their community was manufacturing weaponized pathogens a few miles from their homes. Burns was producing weapons-grade biological agents while children played in the parks and families ate dinner, and Homer Simpson's mother tried to figure out who she wanted to be. Mona and her group broke into the laboratory. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent stored in the facility. During the operation, they accidentally cured the asthma of the security guard on duty, who happened to be Clancy Wiggum, the same man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid succeeded. The pathogens were destroyed. But Mona made one mistake. As the group was fleeing, she stopped. Someone had been knocked down in the chaos. She stopped to help them. The person she stopped to help was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI immediately. From that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family without placing them in danger from federal law enforcement. She could not hold her son or explain to him why she was about to disappear. She kissed Homer goodbye in the dark while he was sleeping and walked out of his life. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead, and Homer spent 3 decades believing that he was the kind of son a mother would leave. Now watch what the show does with this. Burns did not simply report Mona to the FBI and consider his involvement concluded. He pursued her. He maintained an active interest in her capture for decades. He held a personal grudge against a woman who had destroyed his weapons facility, and he used his resources and his influence to ensure that she could never safely return to her family. When Mona finally comes back to Springfield in the Season 7 episode, Burns recognizes her almost immediately, through a cab window, from a momentary glimpse. He identifies her on sight after 27 years. He calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother a second time. And this time, Homer knows why she left the first time. He knows the full story. He knows who forced her out. He knows that the man who has been signing his paychecks for his entire adult career is the same man who stole his childhood, who drove away his mother, who left him to grow up believing he was unloved. Homer does not connect these things. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not appear to fully process the architectural connection between the billionaire who ruined his family and the billionaire who employs him. The show treats this not as a joke, but as a tragedy. Because Homer Simpson, as the radiation theory and the coma theory both suggest in different ways, is not capable of making that connection. His brain, damaged by the crayon, worn down by radiation, impaired by decades of working in proximity to the plant that has compromised the entire town's cognitive function, cannot assemble the pattern that is sitting directly in front of him. Burns did not merely ruin Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. By forcing Mona out of Springfield when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up with a specific psychological profile: desperate for approval, incapable of sustained challenge to authority, terrified of abandonment, grateful for any stability offered to him, even stability that comes at enormous personal cost. Burns needed a safety inspector who would not inspect, who would not file reports, who would not push back, who would show up every day and perform the minimum required function of his role while ensuring that every actual safety issue remained unaddressed. Homer's psychological damage, rooted in the maternal abandonment of his childhood, produced exactly that employee. And the show confirms this connection in a later episode that reveals an additional layer. Burns had committed an unspecified crime at some point in the past, and Grandpa Simpson discovered it. Rather than report what he knew or confront Burns directly, Abe made a deal. Burns would guarantee Homer permanent employment at the power plant, regardless of performance, in exchange for Abe's silence. The contract was informal, unwritten, never disclosed to Homer, but it held 742 documented errors over Homer's career at the plant, and he was never permanently dismissed. The deal protected him. The deal that his own grandfather made with the man who destroyed his family. 3 generations of Simpsons, each responding to Burns in a different way. Mona fought him and lost everything. Abe discovered his crime and made a deal with him. Homer works for him and does not know why he cannot be fired. And Burns, sitting at the top of this arrangement, having shaped the psychology of one generation by removing a mother and the employment security of the next through a deal with a grandfather, has built a situation where the Simpson family is structurally dependent on the man who is responsible for their most fundamental damage. Homer's mother was a radical who fought against an illegitimate weapons program and paid for that fight with her family. The man she fought retaliated not just against her but against the family she left behind. Her husband made an accommodation with the enemy and buried the truth of it. Her son inherited the consequences without ever being told what they were or who caused them. Burns did not take Homer's mother. He took Homer's potential. The show proved this in the episode where the crayon is removed and Homer becomes the intelligent, articulate, perceptive person he would have been if his development had not been systematically undermined. That person exists inside Homer. He existed before the crayon. He might have existed if Mona had stayed, if Burns had not intervened, if the system had not conspired through multiple mechanisms across 3 decades to keep Homer exactly where Burns needed him. Homer chose to put the crayon back in because being intelligent in Springfield was unbearable, but that choice was constructed by circumstances he had no part in creating. He was never meant to be intelligent in Springfield. The architecture of his life, built by Burns's grudge and Abe's deal and Mona's exile, was designed from the beginning to keep him small and compliant and exactly where he was needed. Mona Simpson died in a later season. Her death scene is quiet and specific and does not reach for sentiment in the way lesser episodes would. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew leave him a final time. There is no joke. There is no cutaway. There is no reset by the next scene. There is a man and his mother and the weight of 27 years pressing down between them that can never be recovered. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. The jokes are real and they are often brilliant. But underneath every joke, underneath every pratfall, and every absurdist scenario, and every couch gag, and every Homer scream, there is a family that was broken by one man's decision to weaponize a grudge across generations. Mona fought back and paid everything. Abe accommodated the power and sacrificed the truth. Homer inherited the wreckage and could never understand why his life felt so heavy, or why his work felt so inescapable, or why the man who could never remember his name was somehow the one person in Springfield he could never actually leave. Burns won. In this story, as in so many of Springfield's stories, Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules say Homer Simpson reports to Sector 7G every morning. Because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, because the richest man in town needed a specific kind of broken man in a specific chair, and Homer was broken before he ever sat down in it. Section 9. Where is Springfield? The town that refuses to be found. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. This is not a casual claim. More people can identify Springfield on sight through its skyline and its power plant and its specific brand of impossible geography than can name the capital city of half the states in the actual United States. It has been on screen for longer than most of its audience has been alive. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire that has been burning for decades, a gorge, a harbor, a monorail, an elementary school that has somehow survived everything thrown at it, 2 hospitals, a prison, a shopping mall, and a quickie mart that functions as one of the show's most reliable geographic anchors. It also has mountains and oceans and deserts and farmland and dense forest. It borders Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you are watching. It is located on the coast, and also in the heartland, and also near the Canadian border, and also near Mexico. Its climate ranges from severe blizzard conditions to tropical heat waves within a single season. It contains geographic features that no single American city could plausibly have within its immediate surroundings. Springfield does not exist in any state because Springfield exists in all of them simultaneously. The show has been deliberately contradicting itself about the town's location for its entire run. Every time a piece of evidence appears that seems to narrow the possibilities, another piece of evidence appears in a later episode that invalidates it. In one episode, Springfield is clearly in the north. In another, it is clearly in the south. Lisa's area code begins with 636, which is a Missouri prefix. The state abbreviation has been shown as NT, which does not correspond to any actual American state. When Homer calls the state capital in one episode, the voice on the other end identifies the state as one beginning with a vowel, which eliminates some possibilities but leaves dozens open. The show teases geographic specificity and then immediately withdraws it, over and over, across 3.5 decades. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed the location question directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He said he named the town Springfield because it is one of the most common city names in America, present in nearly every state, and because he grew up near Springfield, Oregon. He confirmed Oregon as the inspiration. For approximately 2 days, the question appeared to have an answer. The show immediately continued contradicting this revelation. Episodes aired after the interview that place Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor the creator's confession. The mystery was maintained because the mystery was not an accident or an oversight. The mystery is the point, and it is worth spending time on what the point actually is. Springfield's geographic impossibility is, on the surface, a comedy device. A town that could be anywhere is a town that feels familiar to every viewer regardless of their actual location. You can be from rural Maine or suburban Los Angeles or the Texas Panhandle and recognize Springfield, because Springfield contains something from everywhere. Its industrial decay is Rust Belt. Its suburban sprawl is Sun Belt. Its small-town insularity is New England. Its wide, blank optimism is the Midwest. It is an architectural Frankenstein assembled from pieces of every American community that has ever existed. The show's creators have confirmed this as intentional design philosophy. Springfield is meant to resonate with the broadest possible audience by belonging to everyone and to no specific place. This is true and deliberate, and the writers have said so explicitly. But the theories we have been discussing suggest something that runs beneath the surface explanation. If the radiation theory is true, if Springfield's environmental contamination has warped the biology of everyone who lives there, why should the contamination stop at biology? The people of Springfield have 4 fingers and yellow skin and survive injuries that should be fatal. The fish have 3 eyes. The animals display physical characteristics that deviate from their species' normal appearance. If radiation has bent the rules governing biological matter in Springfield, the theory suggests that the physical landscape might not be exempt from that bending. Springfield has both mountains and ocean and desert within driving distance because the contamination does not just affect living things, it affects the space itself. The radiation has compressed geography, folded incompatible landscapes into proximity, bent the rules of physical distance and regional climate in the same way it bent the rules of human biology. This is speculative even within the framework of the theory, but it is consistent with how the theory handles every other impossibility in Springfield. The coma theory's answer to the geographic question is more emotionally immediate. Homer's dreaming mind does not have a precise, cartographically accurate map of America in its memory. It has impressions, fragments, feelings associated with places he visited or drove through, or saw on television, or heard described by someone at the plant, mountains from a family vacation, ocean from a commercial he watched from a hospital bed, desert from a movie, farmland from a road trip. His unconscious mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered, layering them on top of each other without any regard for geographic coherence, because dreams do not organize space the way waking consciousness does. Dreams organize space according to emotional association. Everything Homer loved or feared or missed or wanted gets pulled toward the center. And Springfield, the place he is dreaming about, ends up containing everything because everything he has ever experienced gets absorbed into it. Springfield feels like America because it is assembled from Homer's memory of America, which is scattered and incomplete and organized by longing rather than geography. The principle and the pauper theory, the reading that Springfield operates through collective denial and the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, offers a third explanation that is more structurally specific. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot bring regulatory action against a nuclear power plant if the state it is located in keeps shifting. You cannot hold anyone accountable through a legal system that cannot establish jurisdiction because the jurisdiction is permanently undefined. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means someone arrives with a map and a warrant and begins asking questions about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who remembers the Spanish-American War as a personal experience. The town's geographic uncertainty is not just a narrative device, it is a legal shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent EPA oversight, no permanent state attorney general to pursue an investigation into the nuclear facility. Springfield moves between jurisdictions because every time a jurisdiction tries to establish authority over it, the show places it somewhere else. The episode called Behind the Laughter, the show's 12th season mockumentary about the Simpson family, makes this explicit in a way that only makes the mystery stranger. When the episode originally aired, the family was identified as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to a different state. The answer to where Springfield is literally depends on which version of the episode you are watching. The show gave the audience a definitive answer and then changed the answer depending on the platform and the broadcast context. Even when Springfield has a location, the location is not stable. Every state in the Union has been proposed as Springfield's home at various points in the show's history. Every proposal has evidence supporting it and evidence disproving it. The evidence on both sides was put there deliberately as part of the show's sustained commitment to ambiguity. Springfield will never be found. Not because the show cannot decide, but because the show decided long ago that Springfield is worth more as a mystery than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone. A town that belongs to everyone is a town that nobody can shut down, and nobody can regulate, and nobody can hold accountable for anything that has happened within its borders. And a town with no fixed borders has no borders that can be sealed. Except, of course, for the dome. Section 10. The Floating Timeline. Why nobody ages and what that really means? Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted on the 17th of December, 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then. She is 8 now. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They still are. Maggie was 1 year old. She still is. In the world outside the show, 36 years have passed. In Springfield, 0 years have passed. The characters exist in a permanent present tense, locked at the ages they occupied when the series began, living through decade after decade of technological and cultural change without adding a single year to their lived experience. The industry term for this is floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. An episode airing in 2025 depicts the characters living in 2025. An episode from 1995 depicted them living in 1995. The year changes around them. The technology changes. The references shift. The characters do not. They exist in temporal suspension, frozen at a fixed developmental point, while everything surrounding them continues to evolve. Most long-running animated series use this approach. Most viewers accept it without sustained examination. The Simpsons has been running long enough, however, that the floating timeline has produced contradictions so extreme and so structurally significant that they have cracked the foundation of the show's internal reality. The show can no longer simply ask you to accept the convention without the convention generating questions the show cannot answer within its own logic. The most visible of these contradictions involves Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their shared history was grounded in a specific era. They met in high school during the late 1970s and early 1980s. The cultural details of their courtship, the music, the fashion, the social context, were anchored to a particular moment in American history. This made sense for characters who were supposed to be in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. Their past connected logically to their present. But the floating timeline moves only forward. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not meet in 1980. They met somewhere around 2005, which means their high school experience was not shaped by the cultural landscape of the 1970s. It was shaped by something entirely different. The show has acknowledged this, depicting Homer and Marge's past in different ways across different flashback episodes, placing their formative years in different decades depending on when the episode aired. They were grunge-era teenagers. Then they were 1990s slackers. Then they were early 2000s young adults. Their origin story has been told and revised at least 4 times, each version repositioning their shared history to maintain a plausible relationship to the ever-advancing present. Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. They have an approximation of a past, a narrative draft that gets revised every few years when the previous version becomes too inconsistent with the current timeline to sustain. Their memories are unstable. Their origin is rewritten on a generational schedule. And the show treats this as normal, because within the logic of the floating timeline, it is normal. Characters in a floating timeline do not have histories. They have whatever backstory is required to make the current episode function. When the next episode needs a different backstory, the previous one is discarded without ceremony or explanation. Now apply every theory we have discussed tonight to this single fact, and watch what happens. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. Homer went under in April 1993 with his children at specific ages, his wife at a specific age, his neighbors in specific configurations. His dreaming mind cannot imagine them older because it does not have the experiential data of watching them age. The children are frozen because Homer's last memory of them is frozen. The backstory keeps shifting because Homer's dreaming mind is trying to assemble a coherent past from fragments, and as the dream continues and the mind deteriorates, the fragments keep rearranging themselves into slightly different configurations. The instability of the backstory is not a production choice. It is the symptom of a brain that is losing its grip on the narrative it is trying to construct. The radiation theory says nobody ages because the cellular mutations produced by decades of environmental contamination have disrupted the normal biological processes that govern aging. The same contamination that gives Homer inhuman physical resilience, that gives Maggie extraordinary cognitive capacity, that gives Burns an impossible lifespan through weekly maintenance, has also somehow suspended the aging mechanism in the residents of Springfield. Their bodies do not progress through time the way normal human bodies do. They are locked in a kind of biological stasis produced by the same environmental factor that produced every other abnormality in the town. The denial theory from the principal and the pauper says nobody ages because Springfield has collectively agreed not to acknowledge it. The same mechanism that voted to maintain Tamzarian as the real Skinner, the same social contract that makes it implicitly illegal to acknowledge inconvenient truths, has extended to the most fundamental inconvenient truth of all. Time passes and people change. Springfield has voted not to notice. The floating timeline is not a production device. It is the show's most comprehensive expression of Springfield's capacity for collective denial. The whole town has agreed not to let anyone get older, and as long as the agreement holds, it holds. Burns's immortality theory says that at least one character in Springfield has demonstrated that the normal relationship between time and human biology is negotiable. Burns has been alive for more than a century through artificial means. If one person in Springfield can circumvent the aging process through technology and wealth, then the concept of aging is already established within this universe as something that is not inevitable, not fixed, not a law that applies equally to everyone. And if it does not apply equally to Burns, the theory asks, why assume it applies uniformly to anyone else? The prediction theory says the show and American reality have been in a feedback loop for 36 years, with each shaping the other in ways that blur the boundary between fiction and cultural reality. If Springfield has influenced American culture so thoroughly that some of its satirical observations became reality, then the show's own existence has become a cultural force rather than just a narrative one. The floating timeline in this reading is not a convention of production. It is the show reflecting the way cultural artifacts exist outside of normal time. The Simpsons is not aging because the show has transcended its own timeline and become a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, as present in 2025 as it was in 1995, as immediate and recognizable as it was on the day it debuted. All of these theories arrive at the same destination from different starting points. Time does not work in Springfield. Not because the show is animated and animation is exempt from the rules of aging, because something about Springfield, whether it is radiation or a coma or collective denial or engineered longevity or a feedback loop between fiction and reality, has fundamentally altered the relationship between this place and time. The floating timeline is not a narrative convenience. It is a symptom. The show is telling you that these characters are trapped, locked in a loop, cycling endlessly through variations of the same lives without progression, without development, without the conclusion that time should eventually deliver to every living thing that exists within it. The show knows how to imagine its characters aging. It has done this. In the Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, a flash-forward depicts Lisa as a 23-year-old woman engaged to be married. The future it constructs is detailed and emotionally specific. Lisa has grown into the person the show always implied she would become. Intelligent and principled and lonely, and searching for connection in a world that does not quite know how to receive her. The episode proves that The Simpsons can tell the story of who these characters become if time is allowed to work on them. But it chooses not to. The flash-forward is a single episode, contained and isolated, a glimpse through a window that closes as soon as it opens. Lisa returns to being 8 years old. Bart returns to being 10. The future is sealed away, and the permanent present resumes as though the glimpse never happened. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And this choice, sustained over 36 years, suggests that the refusal is not casual or unconsidered. The show is committed to the loop because something about the loop is essential to what the show is doing. Here is what I think the show is actually saying with the floating timeline. Under all the production necessity and the narrative convention and the theories we have spent this entire night exploring, The Simpsons is the American family. That designation is not just marketing. It reflects something real about the cultural position this show occupies. For 36 years, this family has been the reference point against which American domestic life is measured, reflected, satirized, and in some cases, defined. They are the family that everyone recognizes because they contain something from every family. Homer's inadequacy, Marge's exhausted patience, Bart's refusal to fit into structures that do not make sense to him, Lisa's loneliness in a house that cannot contain her, Maggie's silence, and the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, cannot be allowed to change. Homer must remain middle-aged, Marge must remain patient, Bart must remain 10. Lisa must remain 8 and be brilliant and fighting and alone. Maggie must remain the silent observer in the background. The dynamic must be preserved. The structure must hold. Because the moment the Simpson family ages, the moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves away and Homer retires and Marge is left in an empty house on Evergreen Terrace, the show is no longer a comedy. It is an elegy. It is the story of a family that ran out of time. And American culture does not want that story. It wants the version where the kids are always young and the parents are always together and the house always looks the same and the couch gag always plays and nobody ever has to say goodbye. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we need them to be, because they represent something we cannot afford to let end. The chaotic, dysfunctional, exhausting, loving, resilient American family, the family that survives everything, the family that resets after every disaster and starts fresh every Sunday night. They do not age because aging means ending. And the American family, the idealized version that this show has spent 36 years both celebrating and satirizing, is not allowed to end. Not in television. Not in our imagination. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week to make sure the walls are still standing, and the family is still intact, and the timeline is still floating safely above the ground where real time passes. Every theory in this video, the radiation, the coma, the denial, the immortality, the predictions, arrives at this same point. Something has broken the rules of time in Springfield. The loop runs. Nobody escapes. The characters are trapped in it. But so are we. We pressed pause in 1989, and we have never pressed play. Because playing means the story continues forward, and continuing forward means one day it ends. And the end of The Simpsons would mean something we are not prepared to admit. That 36 years have passed. That we are older now. That the couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits is gone, or in someone else's house, or at the bottom of a landfill somewhere. That the family we grew up with is not our family anymore, because families age and change and disperse and become something different from what they were. As long as the loop runs, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer stumbles through the front door at 5:30 and Maggie sits in her high chair watching everything, we do not have to admit any of that. We can turn on the television. We can go home to Evergreen Terrace. We can sit down on the couch with a family that never changes, in a town that never ages, in a show that never ends. And Springfield will be there when we arrive. It always is. That is the whole point. Bringing it all together. the loop, and what it means. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We have traced the path of radioactive contamination from the cracked cooling towers of the power plant through the water supply and into the bodies and brains of every resident who has ever lived in this town. We have followed Homer into the coma he may have never woken up from, and we have sat with the possibility that every adventure, every guest star, every impossible survival is the dream of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General who just wants to go home to his family. We have reopened the Burns shooting case and found that the official verdict is considerably less settled than 30 years of certainty have made it seem. We have examined the architecture of Burns's immortality and understood why a man who has been alive for more than a century is, in some ways, the least mysterious thing in this town. We have watched Springfield vote to make truth illegal and exile the one man who insisted on telling it. We have sat behind Maggie's silence and tried to understand what is thinking behind those enormous, unreadable eyes. We have counted predictions and understood the mechanism behind them, and still felt the faint, persistent unease of the ones that resist easy explanation. We have followed Mona Simpson's trail from a 1969 Springfield kitchen to a federal fugitive file to a deathbed in a later season, and traced the wreckage of one man's grudge across 3 generations of a family. We have searched for Springfield on every map and found it everywhere and nowhere, and we have stared at the floating timeline until we understood that the loop is not a flaw in the show's design. It is the show's most honest statement about what it is. Every theory we explored tonight uses different evidence and different logic and arrives through a different route, but they all end up in the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental and structural and deep, something that goes further than animation conventions or episodic storytelling or cartoon logic. Whether that something is radiation, or a coma, or collective denial, or institutional corruption built across a century by one man's determination to stay alive and in power, something has broken the rules of reality in this town. And the show has been telling you about it since the first episode, not through dramatic revelation, not through exposition, but through accumulation. Through the slow and patient layering of detail upon detail until the picture is unavoidable. Springfield is not hiding its mysteries. The show puts them on screen every week. The three-eyed fish, the cracked cooling towers, the luminous rats, the human skeletons in the basement, the glowing billionaire wandering through the woods, the baby who shoots a man and then checks to make sure nobody saw her, remember it, the principal who is not who he says he is, and the town that decided, by unanimous vote, that this was fine. The floating timeline that has kept a 10-year-old 10 years old for 36 years. The mother who kissed her sleeping son goodbye in 1969 and could not come back for 27 years, and the man who made sure she could not. All of it is on screen. All of it is visible. The show is not hiding it. The residents of Springfield cannot see it because the same environment that produced all these mysteries also damaged the cognitive capacity required to connect them into a pattern. The audience does not see it because we have been watching long enough to normalize everything we once would have found alarming. We are in the position of the Springfield residents now. We look at the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the ageless children and the billionaire who should be dead, and we say, yes, that's just how it is there. That is just Springfield. The theories exist because some people refuse to accept that answer. They looked at Springfield and saw not a quirky animated backdrop, but a place with a specific history, a specific cause for its specific strangeness, a systematic explanation for things that the show presents as random. And the more carefully they looked, the more the explanation held together, the more the details accumulated into something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or lazy writing. What they found, what we have explored tonight, is a version of Springfield that is stranger and more tragic, and in its own way, more beautiful than the one the show presents at face value. A Springfield where Homer's stupidity is not a character trait but a scar left by a system that broke his family before he was old enough to understand what was being done to him. Where Maggie's silence is not developmental delay but the smartest strategic decision anyone in this family has ever made. Where Burns's impossible longevity is the logical endpoint of what unlimited wealth becomes when you strip away every obligation except self-preservation. Where Marge's patience is not a personality trait but the structural load-bearing element that keeps an entire family from collapsing under the weight of everything that has been done to them. Where Bart's rebellion is the only sane response to a world that has stopped making sense. And where Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and fighting every day, is the only person in Springfield who has not stopped asking the questions that everyone else agreed to stop asking. That is The Simpsons. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, the longest-running animated series in American history, the most analyzed, most theorized, most dissected show ever created. And after all of that analysis and all of those theories and all of the time spent trying to decode what is actually happening in this town, the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why can we not let them go? Maybe because they are us. Maybe because Springfield is our town and Homer is our father and Marge is our mother and Bart is who we wanted to be and Lisa is who we should have been and Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep hidden, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting for the moment when it is finally safe to speak. Or maybe it is simpler than all of that. Maybe we cannot let them go because letting them go means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older now, that the world we were living in when this show began is a different world from the one we live in now, and we are different people, and the distance between then and now is larger than we are comfortable measuring. As long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10 and Homer is still stumbling in the door at 5:30 covered in whatever the reactor did to him today, we do not have to measure that distance. We can sit down on the couch. We can go home to Evergreen Terrace. We can be in a place where nothing changes and nobody ages and the family is always intact and the beer is always cold and the credits always roll. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. And we keep it running. Every time we watch. Thank you for spending the night in Springfield. If any of this kept Cole awake or found you somewhere between sleep and waking, drop a comment. Tell me what you thought. Tell me which theory sat with you the longest after the lights went out. And if you want more nights like this one, you know where the subscribe button is. Springfield will be here in the morning. It always is. End of script. These passages are inserted within their respective sections to expand each to 4,000 to 4,500 words. The yellow skin itself deserves its own examination, because it is the detail that the show presents as most universal and most unquestionable. Every person in Springfield is yellow. Every long-term resident, every character who has built their life in this town, carries that yellow pigmentation as a biological baseline. Nobody comments on it. Nobody wonders about it. Nobody in 36 years of television has looked at their own hand and asked why it is that particular shade. This is notable because human beings in the real world notice skin color constantly. It is one of the primary categories through which humans perceive and process each other. The complete absence of any notice, any comment, any curiosity about Springfield's universal jaundice is itself evidence of something. Either the residents are so accustomed to it that it has fully ceased to register as unusual, which would require that the yellowing has been present for their entire lives, from birth, predating any personal memory of looking different, or the cognitive damage from radiation exposure has compromised the specific neurological processes that flag anomaly. They cannot notice the yellow because the mechanism for noticing it has been degraded, along with the mechanisms for noticing the three-eyed fish and the luminous rats and the billionaire who walks out of the woods glowing in the dark. There is also the question of other towns. When the show depicts Springfield in contrast with other communities, the visual difference is immediate. Episodes that take characters outside of Springfield show the world being populated by people who look different in ways that go beyond simply being drawn with different character designs. The show's visual language consistently treats Springfield residents as distinct from the surrounding population in a way that supports, within the show's own internal framework, the reading that something specific has happened to the people in this particular place. The environmental contamination theory is also supported by something the show treats as background detail, but which is remarkably specific when you examine it. Springfield has a tire fire, not a metaphorical tire fire. An actual fire, burning tires, producing black smoke that has been burning continuously for long enough that it is established as a permanent feature of the town's landscape. The characters know about it. They reference it occasionally. And nobody in Springfield is working to extinguish it. The fire just burns. It has been burning since before the show began, and it continues to burn. And the smoke from burning tires contains benzene, toluene, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and a range of other compounds that are known carcinogens and endocrine disruptors. The people of Springfield breathe the output of a continuously burning tire fire, along with whatever the nuclear plant is leaking. The air quality in Springfield is, based on canonical evidence within the show, catastrophically compromised through at least two separate ongoing sources. Then there is the river. Blinky was caught in a river. Radioactive waste has been dumped into local waterways. The town's water supply comes from somewhere, and given what the show has established about where the contamination is going, the water supply and the contamination are using some of the same infrastructure. The show also depicts Springfield's food systems. The Quick E-Mart operates as the primary convenience store and one of the major food retail options for the town. The products sold there are often past their expiration dates. The food quality is consistently low. Apu himself, the proprietor, has noted that some of the products are of questionable origin and freshness. This is played as jokes about a convenience store, but combined with everything else the theory proposes about what Springfield's residents are consuming, the food chain in this town is another potential vector for whatever is affecting the population. The theory also explains something that seems like pure cartoon convenience, but becomes structurally significant in this framework. Springfield's emergency response infrastructure is consistently depicted as inadequate. The fire department is slow to respond and often ineffective when it does. The police department, under Chief Wiggum's leadership, is depicted as comprehensively incompetent. The medical facilities, while present, are often shown providing care of questionable quality. Under the radiation theory, this systematic institutional failure is not just a joke about small-town bureaucracy. It is the logical outcome of having an entire population with degraded cognitive function trying to maintain complex institutional systems. A town where everybody's brain has been compromised cannot produce fully functional institutions. The police are bad at policing because the officers are working with radiation-damaged brains. The fire department is slow because the firefighters are operating under the same cognitive constraints. The medical professionals miss the crayon in Homer's skull because their diagnostic capacity is impaired by the same environmental factor that put it there in the first place. Burns understands all of this better than anyone else in Springfield, and this understanding is what separates him from the rest of the population. He has not been passively absorbing the contamination for decades. He has been actively managing his own exposure to it through the weekly treatments that keep the effects under control in his specific body. He has access to information about what radiation does to biological systems at a level of detail that no other Springfield resident comes close to, because his personal survival depends on maintaining that knowledge. And while he has been managing the effects on himself, he has been allowing those same effects to accumulate unchecked in the population surrounding him. This is the part of the radiation theory that goes beyond simple negligence or even simple greed. It describes something considerably more deliberate. Burns knows what is happening to the people of Springfield. He knows it because he manages the same process in his own body. He continues to operate the plant in its current state of comprehensive violation, not despite knowing what it is doing to the town, but with full knowledge of exactly what it is doing and what effect that has on the population's capacity to resist him. A cognitively intact Springfield with full awareness of its own contamination would be a town capable of demanding remediation, capable of organizing legal action against the plant, capable of electing local officials who would challenge Burns's monopoly rather than accommodate it. Burns's Springfield, the Springfield that actually exists in the show, is a town where people look at a three-eyed fish and shrug, where they see a man glowing in the forest and think alien rather than radiation, where they cannot connect their own physical and cognitive abnormalities to the most obvious environmental explanation available. That is not a coincidence. That is an outcome that serves Burns's interests so completely and so consistently that the only question is whether it was designed or whether it simply evolved to benefit him through decades of unchallenged operation. The radiation theory does not require that Burns deliberately poison the town as a conscious strategy from the beginning. It requires only that at some point, Burns understood what was happening, understood that it served his interests to allow it to continue, and made the decision to not fix it. The decision to spend $56 million or not to. The decision to acknowledge the violations or not to. These were choices. And the outcome of those choices is the Springfield we have been watching for 36 years. One final detail from the show that the radiation theory finds particularly significant. Homer's brain damage from the coma, 5% of his function lost permanently, is treated as incidental and is never referenced again after the episode in which it is established. 5% of Homer's already compromised brain function, removed permanently during a clinically documented coma, and the show moves on as though this is not worth tracking. Unless the show moves on because that is what the radiation has trained Springfield to do, move on, not track things, not connect events to their consequences, not accumulate evidence toward conclusions that would be inconvenient for the people in power. The town forgets because the town has been chemically arranged to forget. And the safety inspector at the facility producing the chemical arrangement goes to sleep in his chair in Sector 7G, and everything continues exactly as Burns needs it to. There is a particular quality to the way the later seasons of The Simpsons handle consequence that the coma theory explains more cleanly than any other interpretation. In the early seasons, consequences existed. Homer's actions in one episode could be referenced in a later one, relationships developed and changed. The world of the show had a memory of itself. After the coma episode, consequences become largely episodic. Something enormous happens. The world absorbs it. The next episode begins and the slate is clean. Under a straightforward reading, this is standard long-form animated television. Episodes are self-contained to allow new viewers to enter the show without needing extensive backstory. The reset is a production decision. Under the coma theory, it is the signature behavior of a dreaming brain. Dreams do not maintain continuity the way waking experience does. When you wake from a dream and fall back asleep, the next dream does not pick up where the first one ended. Each dream is its own territory. The rules of the previous dream do not persist. If Homer's coma dream is segmented into episodes that reset between sessions, that is not lazy writing. That is accurate to the structure of dreaming, as the escalation of physical stakes in later seasons is also consistent with this reading. Homer's capacity to survive incredibly extreme physical trauma becomes almost a running competition with itself in later seasons. He absorbs damage that would be immediately and certainly fatal to any real human being. He recovers from injuries that have no medical analog. He bounces back from scenarios that should not be survivable. And this escalation tracks with the deterioration of the dream's logical constraints. The closer to the surface of consciousness a dream is, the more it respects physical reality. The deeper the dreamer goes, the less the rules of physics apply to the dream. Homer's increasingly superhuman resilience in later seasons is the dream's rules loosening as the mind generating it loses its grip on the constraints of the waking world. Consider also the way the show handles Homer's relationships with celebrities and famous people as the series continues. The frequency with which Homer meets, befriends, or has meaningful interactions with famous individuals increases dramatically after the coma episode. He befriends musicians and athletes and actors and politicians. He meets world leaders. He is briefly famous himself on multiple occasions. In the early grounded seasons, Homer was a nobody from Springfield. After the coma, Homer's dream self is someone who the world's most recognizable people consistently find interesting and worth engaging with. This is exactly how wish fulfillment works in the unconscious mind. The dreamer is not a passive observer of the dream. The dreamer's desires and fears shape the narrative of the dream, and Homer's deepest desires include being recognized, being important, being the kind of person that interesting and powerful people want to know. The coma dream gives him that in escalating ways as the years pass, because the dream's logic has loosened enough to accommodate increasingly improbable wish fulfillment. The show's relationship to God is worth examining in this context as well. Homer encounters God multiple times across the series. He has direct conversations with a divine presence. He receives attention and engagement from a being the show treats as the creator of the universe, while Ned Flanders, who has dedicated his entire life to devout religious practice, receives no comparable divine contact. Under the coma theory, this is not a theological statement the show is making. It is a reflection of what Homer's unconscious mind needs to believe. He needs to believe that he is special enough to attract God's attention. He needs to believe that whatever is happening to him, it is significant at a cosmic level, not just a man in a hospital bed losing brain function year by year. The God conversations are the dreaming mind telling itself that its suffering has metaphysical weight. The relationship between Homer and Marge in the coma theory is perhaps the most emotionally complete element of the interpretation. In the dream, Homer and Marge's marriage is constantly tested, constantly at risk of dissolving, and constantly renewed. Across hundreds of episodes, their relationship faces threats from outside the marriage, from internal conflict, from the pressures of financial instability and family stress, and the weight of Homer being Homer. And every time, the marriage holds. Every crisis resolves. Every threat is defeated. Marge and Homer remain together. Under the coma theory, this is not a narrative convenience. It is the central anxiety of the dream expressing itself and being resolved over and over, because Homer cannot hold the anxiety of not knowing. He does not know if Marge waited. He does not know if she is still there in the real world, beside his hospital bed, or moved on to the life she had to build without him. The dream cannot answer that question definitively, because answering it would require knowledge the dreamer does not have access to. So instead, the dream plays out the threat and the resolution repeatedly across hundreds of episodes, giving Homer the reassurance he needs without being able to give him the knowledge he actually wants. Marge waits for Homer in the dream because Homer needs her to wait. The marriage survives every threat because surviving every threat is Homer's most fundamental hope. The theory also offers an explanation for the show's relationship to memory and continuity that is more specific than simply episodic storytelling convention. Within individual episodes, Homer's memory functions normally. He remembers events that happened earlier in the same episode, but across episodes, across seasons, the memory function fails. He does not connect experiences from one episode to the next. He does not learn in the way a person accumulates learning from lived experience over years. He resets, not completely, but substantially. This is neurologically consistent with how coma survivors describe their experience of time. The moments of apparent consciousness within a long coma are often disconnected from each other in memory, experienced as separate events rather than as a continuous timeline. Homer's episodic memory failure, his inability to carry meaningful learning from one plot to the next, is consistent with a brain that is experiencing isolated moments of apparent activity, rather than genuine continuous consciousness. The coma theory is not a comfortable interpretation. It strips the comedy from the comedy, at least partially, and replaces it with something more difficult to hold. But it is also not a nihilistic one. The theory insists that Homer's dream is an act of love, that the entire apparatus of the show, the adventures and the impossibilities, and the celebrity encounters and the world resets, is the product of a man who loves his family so much that his unconscious mind has been spending 32 years constructing a world in which they are always there, always intact, always waiting for him at the end of each episode. That is not nothing. That is, depending on how you engage with it, one of the most moving ideas embedded in American popular culture. A man in a hospital bed, losing brain function year by year, spending what is left on building the family he loves out of fragments and impressions, and the desperate wish that when the dream stops, they will still be there. The DNA evidence deserves more careful attention than the show's resolution gives it. The eyelash found on Burns's suit belonged to a Simpson. DNA analysis confirmed this. This was the evidence that pointed the investigation toward Homer rather than any of the other suspects, and it is the evidence that ultimately forms the backbone of the case against Maggie when Burns's testimony redirects attention. But the DNA evidence establishes only that a Simpson was in contact with Burns's suit at some point. It does not establish which Simpson. Homer is identified as the primary suspect on the basis of this evidence combined with his motive and the fingerprints found on a weapon. When Burns then identifies Maggie as the shooter, the DNA is retroactively applied to her rather than to Homer. The reasoning is that Maggie is a Simpson. The eyelash came from a Simpson, therefore Maggie could be the source. This is technically true, but it does not prove that Maggie specifically left the eyelash, and it definitely does not prove that the eyelash came from the shooter, rather than from any number of other interactions between Burns and the Simpson family over the years before the shooting. Homer has worked for Burns for years. Burns has had contact with the Simpson family across many episodes before this one. The presence of a Simpson's DNA on Burns's suit is not evidence of a specific encounter in a specific parking lot at a specific time. It is evidence of contact that could have occurred in any number of contexts. The fingerprints on the weapon are similarly incomplete as evidence. A fingerprint establishes that someone touched the weapon at some point. It does not establish when or in what context. If the weapon was recovered from a location where it could have been handled before the shooting by multiple people, the fingerprint is evidence of access to the weapon rather than of the specific act of shooting. And if the weapon was Burns's own weapon, taken from him before the attack, there are multiple plausible explanations for why various people might have fingerprints on it that do not require any of them to be the shooter. The evidence the show presents as conclusive would, in an actual investigation, raise as many questions as it answered. This is consistent with the alternate endings being produced and the contest producing no correct guesses. The evidence was not strong enough to lead an audience to a clear conclusion, which suggests it was not designed to. It was designed to be adjusted to fit whatever conclusion the writers eventually chose. There is also a timing issue with Burns's identification of Maggie that the show does not address. Burns was unconscious. He was shot and went into a coma and remained in that coma for the duration of the investigation. When he woke, he identified Maggie based on his memory of the parking lot encounter before the shooting, a memory formed under extreme stress, before being shot, by a man who had just been through a traumatic confrontation with the entire town at the meeting. Memory formed under those conditions is notoriously unreliable in real-world forensic and legal contexts. The courts have developed extensive jurisprudence around the unreliability of eyewitness testimony precisely because human memory, even when the observer believes they are certain, is frequently inaccurate under conditions of stress and threat. Burns then remained unconscious while his memory of those events sat in a traumatized brain for weeks before being retrieved. The reliability of what he reported when he woke is not something the show examines, but it is something that any rigorous investigation would have to engage with seriously. The show's willingness to accept Burns's testimony as settling the matter, given all of these factors, is itself a piece of evidence about how Springfield approaches truth. A coma patient's trauma-formed memory, retrieved weeks after the event, is treated as definitive identification and the case is closed. Chief Wiggum is satisfied. The prosecution is satisfied. The family is satisfied, or at least too relieved that Homer is off the hook to push back. And Maggie, who cannot speak in her own defense, cannot dispute the account. This is exactly the kind of evidence management that the principal and the pauper theory about Springfield's collective denial would predict. The town found an answer that allowed it to close the book. The answer was technically arguable enough to be presented as a solution. Nobody was going to be prosecuted because the suspect was a baby, and everyone was motivated to accept the outcome and move on, because the alternative was a continued investigation that would require looking harder at the people who actually had power in Springfield. Accepting Maggie as the shooter meant not looking at Homer, who works at the plant, not looking at Smithers, who knows everything about Burns's operation, not looking at Marge, who had motive and whose guilt Burns might have had personal reasons to suppress, not looking at any of the people in Springfield whose lives are deeply entangled with Burns's continued operation. Blaming the baby allowed the investigation to close without threatening any of the ongoing power structures of the town. That is not a conspiracy in the formal sense. It did not require coordination or a meeting or a deliberate plan. It required only that everyone involved be more comfortable with the answer that solved the problem cleanly than with the answer that would have opened everything up. Springfield chose the clean answer, as it always does. Burns's relationship to his own immortality is also worth examining carefully, because the show provides moments where Burns appears to genuinely reckon with the strangeness of his situation, even as the comedy surrounding those moments prevents the audience from dwelling on them. There are episodes where Burns encounters people from his past, people he knew decades ago who are now dead, and the show uses these moments as comedy about his age. Burns references acquaintances from the 1920s as though they are contemporaries, not realizing or not fully processing that everyone from that era is gone. He makes cultural references that are decades or generations out of date. He uses expressions and idioms that have not been in common use since before most of the audience was born. These are played as jokes about an old man who has not kept up with the times. But under the immortality theory, there is something lonelier in them. Burns has outlived everyone who knew him as a young man. He has outlived the era that formed him. He exists in a present that bears no resemblance to the world he was born into, surrounded by people who have no reference for the events and context that shaped his character. He is the only person alive who has his particular set of memories, his particular understanding of what the world was before it became what it is now. This isolation is the cost of his immortality that the show gestures toward occasionally before moving to the next joke. The treatments keep him alive. They do not keep him connected to the world around him. They do not replace the people who have died. They do not fill the gap between his experience of history and the experience of everyone he currently interacts with. Burns's empire predates him, in the sense that he took control of something already ancient when he began his tenure. The Burns family wealth and infrastructure existed before this particular Burns was born. He has extended it through his life, but he did not create it. This means that the continuity Burns represents is not just personal, it is dynastic. The same power has been operating in the same essential form for generations. The faces at the top changed, but the structure remained. And this particular Burns has maintained the structure long enough that the faces beneath him have changed multiple times while he has stayed at the top. The show depicts Smithers occasionally imagining a future in which Burns has died, and his own life is suddenly without purpose or direction. These moments are treated as comedy about Smithers' unusual emotional attachment, but they also reveal something about the structural reality of their relationship. Smithers' entire professional and personal identity is organized around Burns. His skills, his knowledge, his emotional investment, all of it is oriented toward one person. If Burns dies, Smithers does not simply need a new job. He needs a new reason to exist. The weekly treatment protocol, the management of Burns' medical schedule, the vigilance about his physical condition, all of this has given Smithers' life a daily structure and a felt sense of purpose that would vanish completely with Burns. This gives Smithers a personal motivation to keep Burns alive that goes beyond professional duty or loyalty. Smithers needs Burns alive because Burns alive is the organizing principle of Smithers' entire existence. He has built his life around the maintenance of another life, and that structure is only stable as long as the person being maintained continues to require maintenance. It is worth noting that Burns' immortality is, in this framework, partly Smithers' creation. Burns' weekly treatments are only effective because Smithers ensures they happen. Burns' disease equilibrium is only maintained because Smithers manages the schedule that keeps it maintained. If Smithers' contribution were removed, Burns would not have survived to his current age. In a very practical sense, Smithers has been building Burns' impossible lifespan alongside him, 1 week at a time, for decades. This makes the dynamic between them considerably stranger than it appears on the surface. Smithers is devoted to Burns, but Smithers is also, through that devotion and the practical management it entails, the architect of Burns' continued existence. Burns is alive partly because Smithers decided, day after day and week after week, to keep him alive. Whether Smithers has ever fully understood the power that gives him over Burns is not something the show examines, but it is present in the structure of their relationship regardless of whether either party acknowledges it. Burns' money and medical infrastructure provide the resources for survival. Smithers' competence and commitment provide the execution. Neither alone would be sufficient. Together they have produced something that the show presents as one of its more reliable running gags, the impossibly ancient billionaire who keeps not dying without ever examining the mechanism that produces it. What makes the episode's conclusion particularly striking is that the community does not simply agree to maintain the lie in a passive, unspoken way. They formalize it. They create a legal mechanism for enforcing it. Judge Snyder does not simply decide to let the matter drop. He issues a legal decree. He makes the false version of Skinner's identity official under law. And he makes acknowledging the true version a prosecutable offense with the specific penalty of torture. The show plays this as absurdist comedy, and the torture detail is clearly hyperbolic in tone. But the underlying structure is not absurd. It is the formalization of something that Springfield does informally all the time. Every time the show resets between episodes, every time a catastrophe is absorbed and not referenced again, Springfield is performing an informal version of exactly what Judge Snyder does explicitly here. The community agrees, without formal process, to treat the false version of events as the real one. The principal and the pauper simply made the process visible by doing it in a courtroom with a written decree. The real Seymour Skinner is exiled physically. He is tied to a railroad car and removed from Springfield. This is not metaphorical. The man with legitimate claim to the name and life that Tamzarian has been using is physically expelled from the community. He does not leave voluntarily. He is forcibly removed. By the end of the episode, the truth is not merely suppressed. It is in exile, physically separated from the community that found it inconvenient. This is worth holding, alongside the radiation theory's proposition that the town's collective denial is partly a function of cognitive damage from contamination. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. It is possible that the contamination has degraded the population's capacity for critical thinking and comfortable with sustained examination of disturbing truths, while the community has also developed social and institutional mechanisms for suppressing truth that operate independently of any neurological factor. The biology enables the denial. The institutions enforce it. Both are present in Springfield, and they reinforce each other. There is also a class dimension to the episode that the show does not fully pursue, but that is worth noting. Armin Tamzarian, before he became Seymour Skinner, was a petty criminal from a low-income background with no social capital and no institutional standing. Seymour Skinner, the character Springfield knows, has 20 years of accumulated institutional position, professional relationships, and community standing. When the real Skinner arrives, the choice the town faces is not simply between truth and lie. It is between a person who has built legitimate social capital over 2 decades and a person who arrives with only the historical claim to a name. Springfield chose the established social position over the legitimate historical claim. This is not entirely irrational. Tamzarian has been the actual principal for 20 years. He has built actual relationships, made actual decisions, produced actual outcomes. The real Skinner is, to most of Springfield, a stranger with a compelling backstory. Accepting his claim would mean disrupting 20 years of established reality in favor of an account that is true but practically inconvenient. This is how collective denial actually works in real communities. It is rarely pure cynicism. It is usually a genuine calculation, often operating below the level of conscious awareness, about which version of reality is more useful and less costly to maintain. The true version is emotionally correct and historically accurate. The false version is practically embedded in the existing structures of community life. Most people, most of the time, choose the practically embedded version. Not because they are evil, but because their daily life is organized around it, and the cost of reorganizing is too high. Springfield is not uniquely villainous in this choice. It is unusually transparent about making it. The daycare rebellion in the episode A Streetcar Named Marge, or more explicitly in the episode A Streetcar Named Desire, and later in various other daycare-related content, positions Maggie as a figure capable of collective action. She is not simply individually smart and individually capable. She has demonstrated the ability to coordinate with other infants, to communicate across the language barrier that separates pre-verbal children from each other, and to organize collective behavior toward a shared objective. This is a level of social and communicative capacity that goes beyond even what the individual intelligence tests and problem-solving episodes suggest. It is one thing to be personally smart enough to navigate a complex environment. It is another thing entirely to be smart enough to recognize that collective action is more effective than individual action in a particular situation, to identify potential collaborators who share your interests, to communicate your intention to them across a significant developmental communication barrier, and to coordinate their behavior toward a shared goal in real time. Maggie does all of this. She does it while appearing to be an ordinary baby. She does it while the adults around her are watching and seeing nothing concerning. She does it and then goes back to sucking on her pacifier and staring at the wall, because the performance of ordinary infancy is always immediately resumed. The Daycare Rebellion episodes are also significant because they establish that Maggie's capabilities are not purely reactive. She is not simply good at responding to situations as they arise. She initiates, she identifies a problem, assesses the environment, identifies resources including other infants as potential collaborators, develops a strategy, communicates it, and executes it. That is a complete strategic cycle, from identification through execution, carried out by someone who is developmentally supposed to be incapable of any of its components. There is also the specific nature of Maggie's emotional responses, which the show depicts with a subtlety that rewards careful attention. When Maggie succeeds at something, her emotional expression is not the uncomplicated joy of a baby who got a toy. It is something quieter, more measured, more similar to the satisfaction of someone who achieved a planned outcome than to the delight of someone who was surprised by something good. Satisfaction is a more sophisticated emotional state than joy. It requires a model of how things were expected to go, comparison of the actual outcome to that model, and a recognition that the outcome matched the expectation. Infants are not supposed to have that kind of expectation model in place for complex strategic scenarios. Maggie has it consistently, across multiple episodes and multiple contexts. The question of what Maggie is waiting for, which the show has pointedly declined to answer for 36 years, is the question that the theory finds most interesting. She has demonstrated individual problem-solving capability, collective action capability, strategic patience, and the sustained ability to suppress all of this behind a performance of ordinary infancy. She has been accumulating capabilities and information for 3.5 decades of television. She has watched Springfield. She has watched Burns. She has watched every crisis and every reset and every moment where the adults around her failed to address something that needed addressing. She has watched Ned Flanders receive nothing from a god who talks to her father. She has watched Homer fail to make the connection between his employer and his mother's exile. She has watched Lisa fight and lose and fight again. She has watched and processed and remembered all of it. For what purpose the show has never told us. But whatever it is, whenever it comes, it will not be reactive. It will not be impulsive. It will be the execution of a plan built across decades by the most capable strategic mind in Springfield, operating from the single best position available for someone with her objectives. The position of the person nobody watches. The person nobody suspects. The baby in the carrier who has been listening to everything and planning something and waiting, with the patience that only extraordinary intelligence combined with extraordinary strategic clarity can sustain, for the moment when everything is in place. There is one prediction category that the simple statistical explanation handles least well, and that is the predictions that involve visual specificity rather than general trend extrapolation. When the show depicts a future event as a particular scene with particular visual composition and particular character positioning, and when the real-world event occurs with a visual configuration that mirrors the fictional one, the dart-throwing metaphor does not fully account for it. The escalator descent is the clearest example. The Simpsons did not simply predict that Trump would become president. It showed him descending an escalator surrounded by supporters. Trump's 2015 announcement at Trump Tower involved him descending an escalator, which was immediately and widely recognized as an unusual visual choice for a political announcement, one that became iconic enough to be referenced in countless subsequent pieces of political commentary and satire. The visual echo between the show and the reality is not a match between a general trend and a general outcome. It is a specific visual configuration that appeared in both the satirical prediction and the reality being predicted. One explanation for this specific kind of match is that visual choices are constrained by the physical environment in ways that make certain configurations more likely than others. An escalator descent is a particular kind of dramatic entrance that the physical architecture of certain buildings encourages. If you are making a dramatic entrance in a building that has a prominent escalator, descending that escalator is the physically obvious choice. The show's writers, imagining a dramatic Trump announcement, might have independently arrived at the escalator image because it is the image that the physical reality of Trump's buildings makes most available. The real Trump announcement might have independently arrived at the same image for the same reasons. This is a more sophisticated version of the statistical explanation, one that accounts for physical constraint as a factor in convergence. The prediction was not supernatural. The prediction was that Trump would make a dramatic entrance in a high-profile setting, and the physical architecture of his preferred high-profile settings happened to make the escalator the most natural choice. The show arrived at the same natural choice independently. The prediction phenomenon also raises a genuine question about the show's relationship to American politics and political culture that goes beyond the question of foreknowledge. The Simpsons has been, throughout its run, one of the most consistent and visible critics of the direction American culture and politics were taking. The show identified patterns of growing corporate power, diminishing institutional accountability, the increasing alignment of celebrity and political visibility, and the tendency of American democratic institutions to accommodate concentrated power rather than challenge it. These are all things the show depicted through satire, long before they became the subjects of mainstream political journalism. In a sense, the show was doing what good satire always does, which is seeing clearly what everyone else was seeing but had not yet organized into a clear picture. The writers were reading the same reality that everyone was living in, but reading it with more careful attention to where it was pointing. That careful attention, combined with the creative freedom of animated satire and the willingness to follow an observation to its absurd but logical conclusion, produced content that looked like prophecy because it was actually diagnosis. The diagnosis was accurate. The society was heading in the direction the show depicted. The acceleration of that direction has been variable, and the timing has not always matched what the show suggested, but the underlying trajectory it identified has largely proven to be real. Springfield is not a warning that went unheeded. It is a description that went unrecognized. The conspiracy that the Mona Simpson storyline reveals goes beyond what the show explicitly depicts, and it is worth following the implications into the territory the show leaves unmarked. Burns identified Mona to the FBI in 1969. That identification led to a federal fugitive warrant. Mona spent 27 years living underground, moving between locations, maintaining contact with activist networks, living a life defined by the necessity of avoiding capture. During those 27 years, she occasionally saw Homer from a distance. She kept track of him through whatever channels she could access without exposing herself. She knew he had grown up, gotten married, had children. She could not reach him, but she was watching when she could. Burns knew she was alive for the entirety of those 27 years. He had access to FBI information about the warrant and presumably about the status of the investigation. He knew that the woman who had destroyed his biological weapons facility was living in hiding rather than being caught and prosecuted. And when she finally came back to Springfield, visible and findable, he spotted her within moments and acted immediately to have her removed again. This suggests a level of sustained personal attention that goes beyond normal institutional follow-through on a decades-old federal case. Burns was monitoring for Mona personally. He had maintained enough of an interest in her specific case that he could identify her on site after 27 years through a cab window. That is not what someone does about a former antagonist who has been neutralized. That is what someone does about a threat they consider ongoing. What was Burns afraid of? Mona destroyed his biological weapons facility in 1969. By the time she returns to Springfield in Season 7, whatever was in that facility is long gone. The activists who participated in the raid have dispersed or aged or died. The political climate of 1969 that made the raid possible and gave it cultural cover is gone. What threat does a 60-something former housewife turned grandmother fugitive pose to Charles Montgomery Burns in 1995? The show does not fully answer this, but one possibility the radiation theory suggests is that Mona knows things. She has personal knowledge of what was in that laboratory in 1969. She has first-hand experience of what Burns was producing in Springfield before the power plant, before the nuclear reactor, before the contamination of the water supply. If Mona ever talked to the right journalist, the right congressional investigator, the right regulatory authority, she could provide a thread that, if pulled, might unravel decades of institutionally protected environmental and biological violation. Burns was not just pursuing Mona because of a personal grudge about the 1969 raid, though the show establishes that the grudge is real. He was pursuing her because she is a witness. She has knowledge that is dangerous to him specifically, knowledge that connects him to a history of manufacturing biological weapons that would be legally and reputationally devastating if it became public record. Keeping Mona underground and uncredentialed and unable to speak as an authoritative witness protects Burns from something much larger than the personal humiliation of the 1969 defeat. This reframes the conspiracy in a way that connects it more directly to everything else Burns has done. The biological weapons laboratory, the nuclear power plant with its 342 violations, the contaminated water supply, the suppressed medical establishment, the strategically incompetent safety inspector, the deal with Grandpa Simpson, the pursuit of Mona across 3 decades. All of it is part of the same sustained, comprehensive campaign to maintain Burns's control over Springfield and prevent the full accounting of what he has done from ever becoming visible. Mona was not simply a personal enemy. She was the person who came closest to threatening the entire apparatus. She destroyed the biological weapons program, which removed one category of Burns's liability. She is a witness to that destruction, which means she is evidence that the program existed, and she is, in the show's framing, the most morally coherent figure who ever directly challenged Burns, which makes her existence a symbolic as well as a practical threat to the narrative Burns maintains about himself and his relationship to Springfield. Burns destroyed her family to keep her from speaking. That is the precise shape of what he did. He used the mechanisms of federal law enforcement, triggered by his personal report of her identity, to ensure that she could never safely return to the place where her credibility as a witness would be most dangerous to him. Her exile was not a punishment. It was a management strategy, and it worked. For 27 years it worked completely, and when it failed, when Mona came back and Homer found her, Burns implemented it again within hours of spotting her. She was removed from Springfield a second time before she could establish any meaningful presence in the community that would have given her words weight. Burns always wins. In Springfield, that is not a statement about the inevitability of power. It is a description of how comprehensively Burns has arranged the field of play. The question of Springfield's location also connects to the question of who would benefit from Springfield remaining unfindable. And that question, in the context of everything else we have discussed tonight, has a clear answer. Burns's power over Springfield depends on Springfield remaining a specific kind of place. A place that is not subject to consistent regulatory oversight. A place where the jurisdiction is always potentially elsewhere. A place where the federal agencies that might investigate the nuclear plant, the biological weapons facility history, the water contamination, the institutionalized denial, are never quite sure which regional office has authority. A Springfield that has a definite state of residence is a Springfield that has a state attorney general and a state EPA and a state legislature that could pass regulations specifically targeting the Burns facility. A Springfield that exists simultaneously in every state and definitively in none of them is a Springfield, where regulatory authority is always potentially contested, always potentially deferred to another jurisdiction, always potentially someone else's problem. The floating geography is not just a design choice that makes the show feel universal. It is, under this reading, the show's acknowledgement that Springfield's impossibility is structural and functional. The town cannot be pinned down because being pinned down would expose it to the accountability that its actual location would require. This also connects to the show's depiction of political authority in Springfield. The mayor, Diamond Joe Quimby, is consistently depicted as corrupt, self-interested, and responsive to Burns, rather than to the voters who nominally elected him. The legal system, as represented by Judge Snyder's willingness to issue a decree making truth illegal, is similarly accommodating to whoever holds the most power. The police department is incompetent and easily influenced. The entire institutional landscape of Springfield bends toward whatever preserves the existing power arrangement. A Springfield in a specific state would be subject to state-level oversight of all these institutions. State judicial appointments, state law enforcement standards, state environmental regulations. By existing in a perpetual state of geographic ambiguity, Springfield effectively exempts itself from the state-level accountability that would apply to any real municipality in any real state. The show does not present this as a deliberate conspiracy to protect Burns through geographic vagueness. It presents it as an artifact of animated storytelling convention. But the outcome is the same either way. Springfield is untouchable because Springfield is unlocatable. And the principal beneficiary of Springfield's untouchability is the man who has been operating a massively violating nuclear facility there for 3.5 decades and never faced meaningful accountability for any of it. The floating timeline also creates something unusual in the relationship between the show and its audience. Viewers who were children when The Simpsons began are now in their 40s or 50s. Their children, who are roughly Bart and Lisa's actual biological ages, can watch the same show and encounter Bart and Lisa at the same stage of life. The show functions simultaneously as nostalgia for adult viewers and as current content for child viewers, because the characters are frozen at the exact ages that make them perpetually both. This is a kind of temporal magic that has no equivalent in live-action television, where the actors age visibly and the gap between the show's past and present becomes part of the narrative. The Simpsons has no such gap. The characters who were 10 and 8 in 1989 are still 10 and 8 today, which means the show's relationship to childhood is permanently live. It is always, for a 10-year-old watching it, a show about someone their age. It has always been a show about someone their age. It will always be a show about someone their age. This creates a generational transmission of the show that is unlike anything in the history of television. Parents who grew up with The Simpsons watch it with their children, and both generations are watching essentially the same show, experiencing it at different levels and through different cultural contexts, but encountering the same characters at the same ages. The floating timeline makes The Simpsons function as a kind of cross-generational constant, a shared reference point that is equally accessible to someone who watched the first episode live and to someone born 30 years later. This may be part of why the loop feels so important to maintain. The Simpsons is one of the few cultural objects that functions as a genuine across-generations touchstone in this way. Ending the floating timeline, allowing the characters to age and the show to conclude, would mean ending that specific cross-generational capacity. The show would become a historical artifact, something that ended at a particular point rather than something that is always ongoing. And that loss, though it might be necessary for narrative integrity, would cost something that no other single decision about the show could provide. The loop is not just Homer's prison or the audience's prison. It is a specific kind of cultural infrastructure that the floating timeline has made possible, and that infrastructure is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable in ways that are easy to underestimate until you imagine it being gone. Imagine a world in which The Simpsons ended in 2010. In that world, the show is a beloved classic, fully concluded, available for rewatch but no longer producing new content. The characters are fixed at the ages they were when the show concluded, but that fixedness is the fixedness of completed art rather than the fixedness of a loop still running. The cross-generational transmission still happens in some form, because classic shows are still watched across generations, but it happens differently. Watching a concluded show with your children is different from watching an ongoing show with them. The concluded show is something you share as cultural history. The ongoing show is something you share as current experience. The Simpsons, as long as it continues to run, is current experience. It is something happening now, not something that happened. And that distinction is not trivial, which means the loop is not just maintained out of inertia or commercial interest, though both of those factors are real. It is maintained because the alternative, letting the show conclude and become historical, would change its relationship to the culture in ways that would not be fully reversible. You cannot unend a show. Once it has concluded, it has concluded. The cross-generational live quality it had while running does not return when it stops. And so the loop continues. And Bart is 10, and Lisa is 8. And Homer stumbles through the door at 5:30, and the family takes their places on the couch, and Springfield is wherever Springfield is tonight. And we watch. And the loop tightens, almost imperceptibly, around all of us. There is a dimension to The Simpsons that sits beneath every theory we have discussed tonight, and it is the one that the show itself is perhaps most honest about, even when it is being least explicit. This is a show about what it means to be working class in America. Not aspirationally working class, not working class as a temporary station on the way to something better. Working class as a permanent condition, a structural position in the economy from which the people who occupy it cannot escape through effort alone, because the system is not designed to allow that kind of escape. Homer Simpson has a job. He has had the same job for 36 years. He works at a nuclear power plant doing a task that the show establishes he is profoundly unqualified for. And he has maintained that position not through competence but through a combination of structural protection, institutional inertia, and the secret deal his father made with his employer before Homer was old enough to understand what was being negotiated on his behalf. He cannot be fired. The deal ensures that. But he also cannot advance, because advancement would require the kind of consistent performance and institutional visibility that Homer's cognitive and behavioral profile do not support. He is frozen at the level where Burns's deal placed him, which is exactly the level that serves Burns's purposes. Sector 7G Safety Inspector. Not too low to be useful, not high enough to have access to information that would be dangerous to Burns. Exactly where Burns needs him, exactly where he will stay. This is not a description of a quirky cartoon job situation. This is a description of the structural experience of working-class employment in America. The inability to advance, the inability to leave without risking the loss of the only stability available, the dependence on an employer who holds all the leverage and is aware of holding it, the daily performance of a job that does not match your actual capacity or your actual desires, because the job is what there is, and what there is what you work with. Homer does not love his job. The show makes this clear repeatedly. He tolerates it. He endures it. He finds moments of satisfaction or connection within it occasionally, usually centered on relationships with coworkers rather than on the work itself. But the work itself is not something Homer would choose if choosing were available. He would not be a nuclear safety inspector by preference. He would be something else. The show occasionally shows us glimpses of what Homer would choose to be if the structural constraints were removed, and those glimpses are consistently more fully alive than the Homer who goes to work every morning and sits down in Sector 7G. The bowling alley episode, in which Homer briefly operates a bowling alley rather than working at the plant, shows a Homer who is engaged and energized and performing at a level that his regular work never elicits. The astronaut episode shows a Homer who is terrified but genuinely present in a way that his daily work never requires him to be. The episodes in which Homer briefly holds different jobs are almost always more emotionally alive than the episodes set in his regular professional context, Because in those episodes, Homer is doing something that actually engages whatever capacity he has. The job he returns to every episode is not that. The job he returns to is the job that was given to him by the terms of a deal he did not make, to serve an employer whose interests are actively opposed to Homer's well-being, in a facility that is contributing to the degradation of his own cognitive function. And he goes every day. Because that is what you do when you have a family and the job is what is available, and the alternative is uncertainty that you cannot afford. The radiation theory makes this more literal than the show probably intended. The job Homer performs every day is physically and cognitively damaging him. The employer he cannot leave is the person responsible for that damage. The structural trap Homer is in is not just economic, it is biological. He cannot think his way out of his situation clearly enough to find an exit, partly because the situation itself has compromised his ability to think clearly. This is perhaps the darkest thing about the show when you assemble all the pieces. Not the supernatural elements, not the conspiracy theories, not even the immortal billionaire and his radiation-maintained existence. The darkest thing is the ordinary one. A man goes to a job that hurts him every day because he loves his family, and the job is what they have. And the person who designed that job also designed the conditions that make leaving impossible. And neither Homer nor his family can fully see this because the conditions that make leaving impossible also make seeing clearly impossible. That is not a cartoon. That is a description of something real. And The Simpsons has been showing it to us for 36 years, dressed in bright colors and accompanied by comedy, which is perhaps the only way you can show something like that to an audience without the audience looking away. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years. And in those 36 years, she has been the character who sees most clearly what Springfield is, articulates it most precisely, and suffers most consistently for that clarity. Lisa is a genius. The show establishes this repeatedly and without ambiguity. Her IQ has been tested and documented within the show's world. Her academic performance, her musical ability, her capacity for sustained complex reasoning, all of it places her in a category of intelligence that nobody else in her immediate family or her immediate community occupies. She is, by every measurable standard, the most intellectually capable member of the Simpson family. And she is miserable. Not always, not in every episode. But the show's baseline for Lisa, the emotional note that her character returns to when the plot of a particular episode is not actively pushing her somewhere else, is loneliness and frustration. She is lonely because nobody around her operates at her level. She is frustrated because she can see what Springfield is and what it is doing to everyone in it, and she cannot make anyone else see it clearly enough to do anything about it. Lisa's relationship to Springfield's various institutional failures is particularly instructive. She is aware that the school is underfunded and the curriculum is inadequate. She is aware that the political system is corrupt. She is aware that the economic system is structurally unfair. She is aware of the environmental contamination at a level that exceeds most of the adult awareness in the community. She has engaged with these issues repeatedly, through activism, through journalism, through direct confrontation of the institutional structures responsible for them. And nothing she does produces lasting change. The show resets. The funding problems remain. The corruption continues. The contamination continues. Lisa learns, within each episode, the lesson of her particular crusade. The show acknowledges her effort, and then the next episode begins and Springfield is as it was. Under the coma theory, Lisa's persistent, reset-proof idealism is Homer's projection of his best hope for his daughter. He cannot let her give up, because giving up would be an acknowledgement that the world he is dreaming about is as broken as it actually is. So in the dream, Lisa keeps fighting. She loses and she fights again. She is frustrated and she fights again. The dream gives her a resilience that is not entirely realistic because Homer cannot bear to dream about her becoming someone who has stopped trying. Under the radiation theory, Lisa's clarity is itself a form of mutation. She is the person in Springfield who has somehow maintained functional critical thinking capacity despite the same environmental contamination that has degraded everyone else's. This makes her simultaneously the most valuable person in Springfield from the perspective of anyone who wants the community to genuinely improve, and the most dangerous person in Springfield from the perspective of anyone whose interests depend on the community remaining unable to see itself clearly. Burns should fear Lisa more than he fears any other member of the Simpson family. Homer is safely compromised. Bart's rebelliousness is entertaining and ultimately inconsequential. Marge is devoted to her family in ways that keep her focused on the immediate rather than the systemic. But Lisa keeps examining the systemic. Lisa keeps asking questions about why the fish have 3 eyes, and why the plant has 342 violations, and why nobody is doing anything about any of it. Lisa is the person who could, if she had access to the right platform and the right audience, articulate the entire conspiracy in terms that would be impossible to dismiss. She is 8 years old and she cannot vote. She is surrounded by adults who are too cognitively compromised to engage with what she is saying at the level it requires. She is in a school system that is underfunded partly as a direct result of Burns's extraction of the oil well from beneath it. She is limited in her capacity to act by every structural factor available. Burns does not need to neutralize Lisa directly. The system does it for him. This is the structural violence that the show depicts most honestly in its treatment of Lisa. She is not defeated by a villain. She is defeated by the weight of a system that has arranged itself to be resistant to exactly the kind of challenge she is capable of making. Her intelligence is real. Her analysis is accurate. Her ability to make change is systematically constrained by factors that have nothing to do with her individual capacity and everything to do with her position within a structure designed to prevent people in her position from making change. That is an 8-year-old's experience in a cartoon. It is also a description of how structural power operates against individual insight in any real community that has arranged itself, consciously or unconsciously, to protect the interests of those who benefit from things remaining as they are. And Lisa, 8 years old, brilliant and alone and keeping trying anyway, is the show's acknowledgement that seeing clearly is not enough. Seeing clearly is necessary. It is the starting point. But the gap between clear sight and actual change is filled with institutional resistance, with cognitive compromise in the people around you, with the weight of a community that has voted, as Springfield always votes, for the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. Lisa sees. Lisa says what she sees. And Springfield listens politely and goes back to what it was doing. That is the cruelest thing in Springfield, not the radiation or the conspiracy or the immortal billionaire. The cruelest thing is that the person who sees most clearly is the one who can do least about it. Bart Simpson has been a rebel for 36 years without ever changing anything. This is worth examining carefully, because Bart's rebellion is one of the show's most consistent and most visible features, and the fact that it produces no lasting consequences under the framework of the theories we have discussed, deeply significant. Bart does not accept authority. He challenges teachers, administrators, his parents, the social norms of the community, and the institutional structures around him. He pranks, he subverts, he resists. He is, in the conventional reading of the character, the id of the show, the part that says no when the proper response would be yes, the energy that refuses to be contained by the structures that expect to contain it. And he fails constantly. His pranks backfire. His rebellions are contained. The structures he challenges absorb his resistance and return to their previous configuration. Bart is 36 years of sustained rebellion against a system that has never been meaningfully disrupted by it. This could be read as a statement about the limits of individual rebellion against structural power. One kid, however determined, cannot disrupt a system designed by generations of institutional inertia and backed by the resources of people like Burns. Bart's rebellion is genuine, and it is ineffective not because it is weak, but because it is individual. He has no coalition. He has no institutional support. He has no access to the levers of actual change. He has cleverness and energy and a complete unwillingness to be domesticated, and none of those things are sufficient against the weight of Springfield's structural reality. The coma theory adds another layer to Bart's endless rebellion. If the show is Homer's dream, then Bart's rebellion is Homer's way of living out something he cannot do in his actual life. Homer does not rebel against Burns. Homer does not challenge the structure that employs him and poisons him and has organized his existence for Burns's benefit. Homer is too damaged, too dependent, too frightened of the alternative to push back against the system that has trapped him. But in the dream, his son pushes back. His son says no when everyone else says yes. His son is the person Homer could not be and could not allow himself to be, made real in the dream and given a platform that the real Homer has never had. Bart's rebellion is Homer's rebellion. It is just safer in the dream, because in the dream, there are no real consequences, And the energy of resistance can be expressed without the terror of what resistance actually costs when the person you are resisting owns your job, your town, and the water you drink. Danny Elfman's theme for The Simpsons is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in television history. The fanfare at the opening, the way it builds from the single note to the full orchestral statement, the playful midsection, the landing on that final chord as the family collapses onto the couch. It has played at the beginning of every episode for 36 years, and most people who have watched the show regularly have heard it so many times that it has become part of their ambient experience of American television. But the theme is worth hearing carefully because it contains something that the theories we have discussed tonight find interesting. The theme is not a simple happy melody. It is a complex, slightly anxious piece of music that moves through keys and shifts its emotional register several times before resolving. The playfulness of the midsection is genuine, but it sits within a larger structure that is not entirely comfortable. There is something slightly unresolved in the show's theme, something that the full orchestral statement resolves by the end, but only through a passage that includes notes that do not belong to a straightforwardly happy tonality. This is a very small observation, and it may be entirely the result of Elfman's compositional style, rather than any deliberate choice about the show's emotional content. But the theme, heard after 36 years of context, functions as a kind of musical summary of what the show actually is. Playful on the surface, more complicated underneath, resolving in a way that feels satisfying without fully addressing the complicated things the middle section introduced. That is The Simpsons. That is the experience of watching it for 3.5 decades. The playfulness is real, the comedy is real, the warmth is real, and underneath all of it, something more complicated has been running the whole time, something the show has been showing you without ever fully saying it out loud. The theme plays. The family rushes home from their various impossible predicaments. They collide on the couch. The television shows them their own faces, watching, and the loop begins again. We have spent a long time tonight inside various theories about Springfield. We have traced the evidence for each one. We have followed the implications where they lead. And we have arrived, as these kinds of investigations always do, at the point where the theories start to fold into each other and the question of which one is correct starts to seem less interesting than the question of what they collectively reveal. Every theory we have discussed tonight, taken seriously, arrives at the same place. Springfield is a place where the normal rules have been suspended, where the consequences that should follow from causes do not arrive, where the people have been arranged, by design or by accident, or by the accumulated weight of years, into a configuration that serves someone else's interests more than their own, where clarity is punished and compliance is rewarded, and the wheel keeps turning without anyone being asked whether they would prefer it to stop. We watch this every week. We have been watching it for 36 years. We laugh at Homer falling down. We cheer when Lisa makes a point that nobody listens to. We feel something complicated when Marge holds the family together through another crisis that should have broken it apart. And we come back next week for more. The coma theory suggests that the dream is Homer's, but there is a reading in which the dream belongs to all of us, in which Springfield is not Homer's unconscious projection but our collective one, the town we built together by watching, the family we preserved by tuning in every Sunday and refusing to let the loop stop. If that is true, then the question the show has been asking for 36 years is not a question about Springfield. It is a question about us. Why do we need this? What does it do for us to watch a family that never changes in a town that never faces its own nature in a loop that never breaks? What is the function of this particular form of suspension, this particular way of holding a version of American family life in amber and returning to it week after week across more than 3 decades? One answer is that The Simpsons represent something we are afraid to lose. Not the show specifically, but what the show holds. The idea that a family with no particular advantages, no wealth, no social position, no particular wisdom or beauty or talent in the conventional sense, can nonetheless hold together, can weather every storm that comes for it, can sit down on the couch together at the end of every week, no matter what happened, and be the family they were at the beginning. That is a hope that is not obviously available in the actual world. Families do not always hold together. The economic pressures that the show satirizes are real, and they do real damage to real families. The institutional failures the show depicts have real-world counterparts that produce real-world consequences that the families living through them do not get to reset away. The loop that The Simpsons offers its audience is not available to the audience outside the television. And yet we watch. And the watching does something. It holds the possibility open. It sustains the image of the family on the couch, together, intact, having survived whatever the episode threw at them. And that image, repeated across 36 years and hundreds of episodes, becomes part of what we think is possible, part of the imaginative furniture of what family might be. That is not nothing. That might be why we cannot let them go. Not because we are trapped in the loop, but because the loop contains something we need to keep being able to see. The family that survives. The house on Evergreen Terrace. The beer in the fridge and the saxophone in the bedroom and the baby on the floor and Homer stumbling through the door at the end of another impossible day and the family absorbing him back into itself, because that is what families do. Springfield is broken. Every theory we have discussed tonight confirms that it is broken in ways that go very deep and extend very far. But the Simpsons on the couch, together at the end of each episode, that is not broken. That is what the whole broken system was for. Homer works at the plant so he can come home to that. Marge holds the household together so that couch can still be a place worth coming home to. Bart and Lisa and Maggie exist in the particular forms they exist in because Homer needed to dream about them, or because the radiation made them, or because Springfield collectively agreed that this particular family would be the one that anchored the town's sense of itself. The theories are tools for seeing the show more clearly. But the show is also a tool for seeing something else, something simpler and more durable than any theory. A family. A couch. The end of another week. Together. That is what 36 years of Springfield comes down to, when you strip away the contamination, and the conspiracy, and the immortal billionaire, and the coma, and all the rest of it. The most ordinary thing. A family in a house. The lights on. Somebody home. We watch because we need to see that it is still possible. That the loop is still running. That the couch is still there. And as long as we are watching, it will be. The theories we have worked through tonight are not the only ways to watch The Simpsons. You can watch it as a comedy and receive everything that it offers as a comedy, which is a great deal. You can watch it as satire and appreciate the precision and consistency with which it has diagnosed American culture for 3.5 decades. You can watch it as animation history, as cultural artifact, as generational touchstone, as background noise from a show you have been half watching your whole life. All of those are valid. All of those are real relationships people have with this show. But the theories offer something different. They offer the experience of watching something you already know and finding in what you already know a picture you have not seen before. A picture that was always there, waiting to be assembled from the pieces that were already in plain sight. The three-eyed fish was always a three-eyed fish. The crayon was always in Homer's brain. The coma was always a coma. The Tamzarian verdict was always a town voting to sustain a lie. The weekly radiation treatment was always the only thing standing between Burns and death. These things did not change when the theories named them. They were there in the original episodes, produced by writers who may or may not have intended them as the building blocks of a dark, coherent picture underneath the comedy. What changed was the way of looking. The willingness to look at the details as evidence rather than as background. The decision to take the show's own internal logic seriously enough to follow it wherever it led. And it led here, to Springfield as contamination zone, as dream, as mystery still unsolved, as machinery of denial made visible, as home to the most dangerous baby in animation history, as an accidental prophet of American culture, as the scene of a 30-year conspiracy against one family across 3 generations, as a town that exists everywhere and nowhere, as a loop that stopped time in 1989 and has been running ever since. That is Springfield. All of it at once. The comedy and the contamination and the conspiracy and the couch. The laugh track and the leaking reactor. The donut and the dying man. The family and the dream. 36 years. 788 episodes. The most analyzed fictional universe in American television history. And the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why do we keep watching? Go look at the couch. You already know the answer. End of script. There is a version of America that believes in fresh starts, that believes any morning can be the one where things turn around, that believes the past does not have to determine the future, and that the future is genuinely open in ways that the weight of the present would not seem to allow. This is the America of the frontier, and the second chance and the new beginning. The America that has always told itself that reinvention is possible, that you can leave the old life behind and build something different somewhere else, that the circumstances of your birth and the conditions of your current situation do not have to be the final word about what your life will eventually become. The Simpsons is deeply embedded in this belief, not because it endorses it uncritically. The show has never been particularly optimistic about American institutions or American power or the American tendency to forget inconvenient history. But the structure of the show, the reset between episodes, the way each week begins with the same family in the same house facing a new situation with the same resources, that structure is functionally optimistic in a specific way. It insists that the past does not accumulate, that what happened last week does not prevent this week from being different, that the family can absorb any damage and return to its baseline configuration, ready to try again. This is the American optimism that the show offers its audience, and it is offered in a form that is emotionally compelling precisely because it is so stripped of the conditions that usually accompany optimism. The Simpsons is not optimistic because things are going well. The Simpsons is optimistic in spite of the fact that things are demonstrably not going well and have not been going well for 36 years, and show no structural signs of going well anytime soon. The optimism is not based on evidence. It is based on the stubborn insistence that the family on the couch at the end of the episode is still the family on the couch, still intact, still together, still there. That is the most American thing about the show, not the nuclear plant or the corrupt politics or the billionaire with the monopoly. The insistence that the family survives anyway, that the love is real anyway, that the reset is not a defeat but a beginning, that every Sunday night is another chance. Under the radiation theory, this optimism is chemically maintained. The population cannot be pessimistic in the sustained, analytical way that would lead to action, because the capacity for that kind of sustained analytical pessimism has been degraded along with the rest of their higher cognitive function. Their optimism is not chosen. It is the emotional state that remains when the parts of the brain that would generate alternatives have been compromised. Under the coma theory, the optimism is the dreamer's most fundamental wish. Homer does not want to dream about despair. He wants to dream about the family making it. So the dream sustains the hope, episode after episode, because the hope is the point of the dream. The dream is not trying to simulate reality. It is trying to sustain the feeling that reality at its best produced, which is the feeling of being the father of those children and the husband of that woman, and having, despite everything, a home to come back to. Under the denial theory, the optimism is the community's chosen epistemology. They are not optimistic because they believe things are good. They are optimistic because they have voted to be optimistic, have decreed optimism as the official position of Springfield, have made pessimism functionally illegal by treating anyone who articulates it as a threat to the community's social contract. 3 different mechanisms, 3 different explanations for the same phenomenon. Springfield's apparently baseless resilience, its capacity to absorb catastrophe and return to something like normalcy, its refusal to be genuinely defeated by anything it encounters. All 3 explanations are dark in their own way. None of them describe an optimism that is freely chosen and genuinely grounded. But all 3 produce the same functional outcome, which is that the family on the couch keeps sitting down together week after week, and the show keeps beginning again, and the loop holds. And we watch. And something in us is satisfied by the watching, even when we cannot fully articulate what that something is or why the satisfaction is so persistent across so many years. Maybe because what the show offers, under all the theories and all the darkness and all the evidence of what Springfield actually is the image of a family that has not given up, not because they have good reasons not to, not because their situation warrants continued effort, but because they are there, together, and being together is the thing that makes the effort feel worthwhile. Homer goes to work tomorrow. It will be bad. He will sleep at his station and eat donuts during warning alerts and cause at least one minor incident that by any reasonable measure should end his employment. And then he will come home, and the family will be there, and whatever happened at the plant will be less important than whatever is happening in the house. And the house will hold, and the family will hold, and the loop will run again. That is 36 years of American television's most durable emotional argument. Not that things are good, not that the system is fair, not that effort is rewarded or virtue is recognized or justice is anything other than something that occasionally shows up by accident in a town where it has no reliable institutional home. Just this: the family holds, the couch is there, come home. After 36 seasons and 788 episodes, that is still the thing. The simple, stubborn, chemically maintained, dream-generated, collectively enforced, radiation-soaked, conspiracy-adjacent, immortal billionaire-haunted, floating timeline suspended, theorized to death thing. Come home. Springfield is waiting. It always will be. Hans Moleman deserves one more moment of attention before we close, because the detail the show established about his age and has never explained is possibly the strangest single fact in Springfield's entire documented history. He claims to be 31 years old. He appears to be in his late 80s or 90s. He has been hit by cars, buried alive, crushed, incinerated, drowned, electrocuted, and attacked by animals, and he returns for each new episode as if none of it happened. He has the worst luck of any character in the history of animation, and he faces it with a resignation that suggests he has been enduring it for much longer than any normal human lifespan would support. If Hans Moleman is 31, then something has aged him catastrophically. Something has compressed decades of biological deterioration into a time frame that should not be sufficient for it. Something has also made him functionally immune to causes of death that should have removed him from the show permanently, because he keeps not being removed. He dies and comes back. He dies again and comes back again. He is the show's most visible, most persistent, most cheerfully accepted impossibility, and nobody in Springfield has ever noticed that something very strange is happening with the small elderly man who keeps dying in the background of their community. The radiation theory has a clear explanation. The coma theory has a clear explanation. The collective denial theory has a clear explanation. None of them are comfortable, but all of them are internally consistent. What they agree on is this: Hans Moleman is evidence. He is walking, dying, repeatedly returning evidence that something in Springfield operates outside the normal parameters of biology and mortality. The fact that nobody in Springfield has ever paused to examine that evidence is itself the most Springfieldian thing about him. He died somewhere in the background while you were reading this sentence. He will be back next episode, as will we all. Something happened in the writer's room at some point in the early seasons of The Simpsons that is worth understanding, because it explains a great deal about how the show accumulated the depth that makes the theories possible. The writers of The Simpsons in its early years were not primarily interested in producing a children's cartoon or even a standard animated sitcom. They were interested in making something that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Something that a child could watch and find funny, that an adult could watch and find funny for completely different reasons, and that a very attentive adult could watch and find disturbing for reasons that neither the child nor the casual adult would access. This layered approach to comedy is not unique to The Simpsons. The best satirical work has always operated this way. Satire that can only be understood by people who are already deeply engaged with the thing being satirized is limited satire. Satire that functions as pure entertainment for people who are not engaged at all, while simultaneously delivering a sharp critique to people who are paying close attention, is the hardest and most durable kind to produce. The Simpsons pulled this off for its first decade with a consistency that has never been fully replicated in American animation. The layers were always present, the surface comedy was always strong enough to stand alone, and underneath it, accessible to anyone willing to look carefully, was the darker picture. The radiation theory depends on this layered approach. The show did not announce that Springfield was a contamination zone. It showed you Blinky the three-eyed fish and let you either accept it as a joke or follow it to its implication. It showed you Homer sleeping at his workstation during meltdown warnings and let you either laugh or ask what that means for the people living downwind. It showed you Burns refusing to spend $56 million on safety upgrades and let you either treat it as character comedy or trace the consequence through Springfield's bodies. The layers were always there. The theories are what you find when you decide to go into the second layer. The show built the second layer deliberately, even if not every element of what the theories identify was placed there with full intentionality. Writers working quickly and under production pressure make choices that turn out to be consistent with patterns they did not consciously design. The creative unconscious is real and it produces coherences that the conscious process does not always track. What the writers of The Simpsons built, whether fully intentionally or through a combination of design and creative intuition, is a fictional world that rewards close attention across multiple generations of viewers who bring different contexts and different analytical frameworks to their watching. The show gave us Springfield, and Springfield turned out to contain more than anyone initially put into it, because sufficiently detailed fictional worlds develop their own internal logic that exceeds what any individual creator can fully account for. The theories are not imposed on The Simpsons from outside. They emerge from inside the show's own world, built from the show's own evidence, following the show's own internal logic wherever it leads. The show created a world rich enough to generate its own mysteries. That is the most generous interpretation of what the writers did, and it is also probably the most accurate one. They built Springfield. They made it detailed and specific and internally consistent enough that close attention over many years would find patterns. They put Blinky in the river. They gave Homer a crayon in his brain. They aged Burns so far past normal human lifespan that his continued existence requires explanation. They gave Maggie a gun and a locked door moment, and 36 years of deliberate silence. They made Springfield exist in no state and all states simultaneously. They showed the town vote to make truth illegal and exile the man who brought it. They built all of this, and then they broadcast it, week after week, for 36 years. And some of us watched closely enough to see what was there. And now you have seen it too. Every town has its version of Springfield's secrets. Every community has things it collectively chooses not to examine too closely. Every group of people who live together under shared conditions develops, over time, a set of agreed-upon fictions that allow daily life to continue without the disruption that full clarity would cause. Springfield makes this visible. It takes the ordinary mechanisms of community denial, and it scales them up, makes them visible, wraps them in bright colors and accompanies them with comedy, and broadcasts them into living rooms across America for 36 years. And the viewers who watch Springfield do their collective denying about whether Springfield is really all that different from the place they actually live. That is the show's most sustained and least acknowledged joke. The audience watching a town that refuses to see itself clearly is itself a town that refuses to see itself clearly. We laugh at Springfield for not noticing what the power plant is doing. We do not ask what is being done to us. We laugh at the residents for choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths. We choose our own. The Simpsons is not primarily about Homer, or Marge, or Bart, or Lisa, or Maggie, or Burns, or Mona, or Ned, or Skinner, or Moleman. It is about us. It has always been about us. Springfield is the mirror, and we are what it is showing. The theories we have explored tonight make Springfield stranger and darker than it appears on the surface, but they also make it more comprehensible, because they offer explanations for why things in Springfield are the way they are, instead of simply accepting them as given. The theories refuse to accept Springfield's reality as fixed and inevitable. They insist on asking why. They follow the evidence to its conclusion, and they say, this is how it works, and this is who benefits, and this is what it costs the people it is being done to. That is a useful way to look at Springfield. It is also a useful way to look at anywhere. Ask why the fish has 3 eyes. Ask who benefits from you not asking. Ask what has been done to the part of you that would normally ask. Ask why the official story is the one you are being told rather than one of the other available stories. The theories do not answer those questions. They show you what the questions look like when they are asked about Springfield, which is a fictional place where asking costs nothing, and the evidence is freely available, and the whole apparatus of the conspiracy is visible if you are willing to look at it directly. In the real world, the questions cost more, and the evidence is less freely available, and the apparatus of whatever is actually happening is better hidden than anything Burns has ever arranged in Springfield. But the questions are the same questions, and the habit of asking them, built across 36 years of watching a show that embedded them in comedy and broadcast them into every American home with a television, that habit is not nothing. Lisa Simpson has been asking them for 36 years, from the position of an 8-year-old girl in a cartoon town where nobody listens to her. Maybe some of the people who have been watching her ask have learned something about how to ask. Maybe that was the point all along. It always is. The economic structure of Springfield is one of the most carefully constructed and least discussed aspects of the show's world-building. Burns owns the power plant. The power plant is the primary employer of the town. The power plant provides the electricity the town runs on. This triple stranglehold, employment, energy, and economic activity all flowing through one man's hands is not incidental. It is the structural condition that makes everything else in Springfield possible. A town with a diversified economic base has multiple centers of power. Multiple employers means multiple sources of income that are not controlled by a single entity. Multiple energy sources means the community is not dependent on one provider. Multiple centers of economic activity means that the failure or corruption of any one of them does not collapse the whole system. Springfield has none of that. Burns is the employer. Burns is the energy provider. Burns is the source of the economic activity that sustains most of the businesses in town because the workers employed at the plant spend their wages at Springfield's shops and restaurants and bars and stores. When Burns's facility is economically healthy, Springfield is economically healthy. When Burns's facility is threatened, Springfield is threatened. The interests of the plant and the interests of the town have been fused into one interest. This is why the town could not challenge Burns even when it discovered what the plant was doing. Even setting aside the cognitive damage that the radiation theory proposes has compromised the population's capacity for that kind of challenge. Even assuming a fully cognitively intact Springfield, the economic dependence on Burns is so total that a successful challenge to his operation would destroy the town's economic foundation along with whatever it was challenging. This is not a unique situation in American economic history. Company towns, communities whose entire economic existence depends on a single employer's continued operation, have existed throughout the industrial era. The dynamics the show depicts in Springfield, the inability to challenge the employer even when the employer is causing demonstrable harm, the fusion of the community's interests with the employer's interests in a way that prevents the community from seeing its own interests clearly, the institutional capture that follows from total economic dependence, these are all historical patterns that real communities have experienced. The show puts them in a cartoon and makes them funny, and this allows the show to depict them without the audience necessarily registering that they are looking at a real pattern. But the pattern is there. Burns's power over Springfield is not primarily political. It is not primarily social. It is economic. He controls the money. And in a community that depends entirely on his economic activity for its own economic survival, controlling the money means controlling everything. The political corruption, the legal accommodations, the institutional capture of local government, all of it follows from the economic foundation. You do not need to bribe politicians when the politicians know that challenging you would collapse the economy that their constituents depend on. You do not need to suppress the legal system when the legal system operates within an economic context that makes challenging you existentially dangerous to the community. The power takes care of itself once the economic conditions are in place. Burns established those conditions. He has maintained them. He has ensured, through the deal with Grandpa Simpson, and through the strategic employment of Homer, and through the management of his plant's output in ways that keep it essential to the town's functioning, that the conditions remain in place. He does not need to actively conspire against Springfield every day. He built the structure that makes the conspiracy self-maintaining, and he keeps the structure standing. That is what makes Burns not just a villain but a system. He is not individually malevolent in the way that makes him satisfying to oppose. He is structurally embedded in a way that makes opposition functionally equivalent to self-destruction. You cannot remove Burns without removing the foundation of Springfield's economic existence. And you cannot build a new foundation without resources that the current structure prevents the community from accumulating. The loop is economic before it is anything else. The radiation and the coma and the denial and the immortality and the floating timeline are all built on top of an economic structure that makes all of them possible by making meaningful challenge to any of them existentially costly. That is the final lesson Springfield teaches, and it is the one that requires the most sustained attention to see clearly, because it is the one the show wraps in the most comedy and presents most consistently as background rather than foreground. The plant is always there in the opening credits. The cooling towers are always visible on Springfield's skyline. Homer drives to work there every episode. It is so omnipresent that it becomes invisible, the way the most powerful things in a community become invisible through ubiquity. Burns is always there. He has always been there. He will always be there, sustained by his treatments and his money and Smithers's competence and the community's inability to imagine a Springfield that does not run on his electricity. That is Springfield. That is the show. That is what we have been watching. Now you can see the cooling towers. You could always see them. You just know now what they mean. You have been with Springfield for a long time tonight. You have followed the radiation through the water supply and into the residents' bodies, and finally into the part of the brain responsible for noticing that something is wrong. You have sat with Homer in his hospital bed and understood the dream from the inside, the family preserved in amber, the children never growing up, the wife never leaving, the loop that offers everything he ever wanted at the cost of everything that was real. You have stood at the scene of the shooting and felt the official answer loosen in your hands as you held it. The sundial that Burns himself said meant nothing. The gun that was already missing from its holster, the baby who waited until the room was empty before she moved her pacifier. You have followed Burns backward through time, through the Spanish-American War and the Gilded Age, and the decades of weekly radiation treatments that keep his diseases in perfect stalemate. His body a closed system requiring constant maintenance, Smithers the maintenance engineer keeping the reactor that is an old man running 1 week at a time. You have watched the town vote to make truth illegal and exile the one man who brought it, and understood that what the show was showing you was not satire about a fictional town, but an accurate diagram of how real communities manage inconvenient reality. You have looked behind Maggie's pacifier and found something watching back. Something that has been watching for 36 years, processing everything, waiting with the patience of someone who understands that timing is the most important variable and the right moment has not yet arrived. You have counted the predictions that came true and understood why the ones that did not come true were never added to the list. You have followed Mona Simpson from her kitchen in 1969 through the raid on the bioweapons lab and out the other side into 27 years of fugitive life, pursued by the same man her son works for, and felt the 3-generation weight of what Burns did to that family by identifying her face and picking up the phone. You have searched for Springfield on a map and found it everywhere and nowhere, in every state that has ever had a nuclear plant or a tire fire or a corrupt mayor or a school that lost its funding because a billionaire needed an oil well. You have stared at the floating timeline until you understood that Bart being 10 years old for 36 years is not a cartoon convention but a wish, a collective wish, held by everyone who has ever watched this show and not wanted the family to age, not wanted the children to grow up, not wanted the loop to break and the family to scatter into individual lives that do not need the couch anymore. This is what the show has been. This is what it has always been. Underneath the comedy and the gags and the celebrity appearances and the couch gags and the annual Halloween specials and the predictions that came true and the ones we forgot. A story about a family, a story about a town, a story about what a community does when it cannot afford to know what it knows. A story about what a man dreams when the only thing he can still hold on to is the memory of a house on a street in a town that does not exist on any map. The reactor hums in the dark. The yellow smoke drifts from the cracked cooling towers into the sky above Springfield, wherever Springfield is tonight. Blinky swims in circles in the river. Hans Moleman is already in the process of dying somewhere in the background of someone else's story. Ned Flanders is kneeling at the side of his bed, praying to a god who is currently having a conversation with Homer Simpson. Maggie is awake in her crib, watching the shadows on the ceiling, thinking something that nobody in the house can hear and nobody in Springfield would believe. And Homer is home. He came home. He always comes home. He stumbled through the door at 5:30, and Marge was there, and the kids were there, and the house was warm, and the beer was cold. And for another episode, another week, another year, the family is together on the couch. The loop holds. Springfield endures. And somewhere in a hospital in Springfield, a man is dreaming. He is dreaming about his family. He is never going to stop. Good night from Springfield, wherever that happens to be.